Hello, I welcome you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Press Center, our regular briefing. We have Russian and foreign journalists with us. We begin with the schedule of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation on April 28-29. The head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergey Lavrov, will take part in a full-format meeting of the heads of foreign ministries of the BRICS countries in Rio de Janeiro. The upcoming meeting under the Brazilian chairmanship will be a good opportunity for a substantive and in-depth discussion of topical issues on the international agenda, the settlement of crises, conflicts, prospects for improving the system of global governance, with an emphasis on increasing the role of the world majority states. The ministers will review the implementation of the agreements of the leaders of the association and outline further steps to develop strategic partnership in the context of preparations for the 17th BRICS Summit, which will also be held in Brazil on the 6th-7th of July. Within the framework of the upcoming BRICS Council of Foreign Ministers, a separate session will be held with the participation of the foreign ministers of the partner states of this association. The role of the Global South in strengthening multilateralism. I would like to remind you that the decision to establish a category of partners was made at the summit of the association in October last year in Kazan during the Russian presidency. And on April 30th, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov will visit the Dominican Republic as part of a trip to the Latin American region. The 80th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations with this country is celebrated this year, and the visit is also timed to coincide with the opening of the embassy of the Russian Federation in the Dominican Republic. Meetings are planned with the president of this country, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. During the talks with the Dominican partners, it is planned to discuss the prospects for the development of bilateral cooperation, including the intensification of political dialogue, increasing cooperation in trade, economic investment, tourism, cultural and humanitarian fields, and, of course, strengthening the legal framework. The parties plan to consider topical issues of the global and regional agenda. Tomorrow, on April 25th, a solemn ceremony of laying flowers and wreaths at the grave of the unknown soldier will take place in the Alexander Garden with the participation of the Foreign Diplomatic Corps accredited in Moscow. This event will be one of the central ones organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of our country for foreign diplomats. In the year of the celebration of the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War, this memorable event will unite representatives of all regions of the globe and show that despite attempts to rewrite history, the memory of the events of those years is carefully preserved all over the world. Now we turn to the current international agenda. The situation around Ukraine. Every day, every hour, every second, Zelensky's incompetence becomes more and more obvious. Following the sabotage of the 30-day moratorium on strikes on energy infrastructure facilities, we have repeatedly talked about this during briefings, proving this with facts on hand. And I remind you, the APU violated that 30-day moratorium 136 times. Actually, the Kiev regime disrupted that moratorium, and it also disrupted the 30-hour Easter truce, announced by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let me remind you, Easter is a holy holiday. At first, Zelensky rejected Russia's offer of a truce for 30 hours during the Easter holidays. And then, obviously, under pressure from Western European curators, who continue to supply him with weapons, and apparently said that at least for appearance it was necessary to show some restraint, he supported this proposal, however, only in words. According to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, 4,900 violations by the armed forces of Ukraine were recorded in 30 hours. In addition to thousands of shelling, the Ukranazis used 90 drones, fired missiles from the American multiple rocket launcher system HIMARS, Kursk region, It's as if Zelensky is deliberately setting up Americans, including using American weapons during the Easter holidays, targeted attacks on Russian civilian targets in the Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, Kherson regions, the DPIE, and the Crimea, violence of a cynical nature. As a result of targeted strikes by Neo-Bandera in the village of Nechayevka, Belgorod region, a woman was injured. 2 underage girls were injured. Donetsk and Gorlovka were shelled, including with cluster shells of 155 millimeters caliber. 3 civilians were wounded. Of course, all this was accompanied by literally weighty remarks on Ukrainian social networks. Here's a look. The fire that arose on the morning of April 20th as a result of one of the UPU strikes at a gas station in the Kalininsky district of Donetsk was called a convergence by supporters or participants in the crimes of the Kiev regime. This is their quote of the holy fire. The Russian army faithfully observed the Easter truce, numerous facts of terror on the part of the UFU militants, on the bright Easter holiday celebrated by world Christianity, again demonstrated complete incompetence. What is there? The complete inadequacy of Zelensky, and apparently these paramilitary gangs of neo-Nazis and mercenaries have already gone into full disarray, who, apparently, do not understand themselves to whom they obey, and are setting themselves up for a fatal escalation of the war for them. Well, the picture of obscurantism reigning in Ukraine during Easter was supplemented by the footage of Ukrainian men fleeing from divine services from the arrived Buildup military commissars. Everything is happening in Ukraine. The half-empty temples of the canonical church captured by the so-called schismatics, in fact by raiders, demoniacal raiders. Here is this picture Easter in Ukraine, 2025. Let me remind you that there are militants in these very temples, in which they are trying to catch the last men in Ukraine and drag them no longer into the trenches, but just straight into the grave. There they also illuminate drones. There they also receive a blessing for crimes against civilians. In general, it seems to me that this is such a unified picture. Here, it is hardly possible to say that some part of it is out of the general gamut. It's all one-to-one. Now about other crimes of the Kiev regime, even outside the Easter truce, the Ukrainists continued to purposefully hunt the civilian population of Russian regions, including women and children. In the Belgorod region, on April 16th, a 10-year-old boy died in the village of Malomykhailovka due to an explosion thrown by a Bandera mine bell. On April 21st, a woman was injured in the village of Long as a result of a drone attack on a residential building. A civilian was injured by a drone on the Tomarovka-Krasnaya Yaruga highway. On April 22nd, in the village of Kasilovo, a drone attacked a car and injured a married couple and their 16-year-old daughter and 19-year-old son. On the 16th of April in Donetsk, after an attack by drone strikes, a girl was wounded, 2000 of the 17th year of birth. In the village of Elenovka, an employee of the organization of the Novorossiya Railway was injured. On the 18th of April, as a result of a night drone strike in the village of Volodarskoy, a boy was killed, 2015th year of birth. In Gorlovka, a man died on the territory of the cemetery due to the detonation of an explosive object. On April 22nd, 7 more residents of the DPIE suffered, including a 14-year-old girl. In the Bryansk region, on April 17th, the Ukrainian armed forces fired mortars at an Orthodox church chapel. In the village of Zernovo, it was completely destroyed. That's right. What kind of Easter truce is there for Zelensky? It seems to me, it's as if their hour has struck for the evil spirits, a special frenzy before the inglorious end. On the 18th of April, as a result of the dropping of an explosive device from a drone, 2 self-defense fighters were killed from drone attacks, including on civilian vehicles. 3 civilians were wounded. Evidence has been obtained of the executions of civilians by the armed forces of Krasnogorsk-Rovka. This is the DPI, before its liberation by the Russian military in September of the 24th year. A criminal case has been opened on the fact of the murder of 3 family members of a resident of the Kalmykev farm of the Kursk region by the militants of the armed forces of Ukraine in January of the 25th year. Russian military investigators have identified the Ukrainian commanders of the armed forces of Ukraine who were involved in a massive drone attack on Kursk on April 15th. This is the commander of the 14th branch of the Regiment of Unmanned Systems, Colonel Dmitry Bondarovich, commander of the 383rd Separate Brigade of Unmanned Aerial Systems of the Air Force, Andrei Gianni, his deputy Vitaly Sindyuk. They suspect of committing the aforementioned terrorist act. And of course, they will have to pay for it all. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for their war crimes and other crimes. The DPIE court has personally convicted militants from the neo-Nazi Azov unit. Let me remind you that this organization is recognized as a terrorist, extremist organization in our country and is banned in Russia. So, in person, the verdict. The guilty verdict was handed down by the representative of this gang to Vladislav Rucky, Andrei Yeroshinsky, and Dmitry Ignatenko. The investigation found that in March of the 22nd year in Mariupol, they, together with their colleagues Andrei Barsky and Yuri Dmitriev, fulfilling an illegal order of the command, fired at least 200 mortar rounds at the granary. There were civilians there. They knew about it. As a result, 1 person was injured. Yaroshinsky's pen received 24 years in a strict regime colony. Ignatenek received 23 years and 9 months. Earlier, Barsky and Dmitriev were sentenced in absentia to 24 and 24.5 years in prison and put on the international wanted list. Alexander Chmel, previously detained by Russian servicemen, was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He committed terrorist attacks in the village of Zhuravli, Kursk region. On August 27, 2024, mined roads, prevented the evacuation of civilians, carried out acts of intimidation with the use of weapons. The captured Ukrainian militant Serhiy Yarmey received 15 years of imprisonment. In September of the 24th year, he repeatedly opened fire on civilians by Russian servicemen near the village of Vetrian in the Kursk region and prevented the evacuation of civilians, also mined roads. The militants of the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Sergei Safronev, Yaroslav Mazur, Dmitry Ogarenko, Kirill Komarev, received from 15 to 16 years in prison for committing terrorist acts. In August of the 24th, they illegally invaded Russia on armored personnel carriers and fired at our military and local residents, as well as mined roads. All 4 were detained by Russian servicemen. Mercenaries from Britain, Georgia, Joseph Philip MacDonald, and Guy Saglian were sentenced to 14.5 and 14 years in prison in absentia. Both of them are on the international wanted list. The criminal case of Oscar Charles Augustus Jenkins, a mercenary from Australia who was previously detained on the territory of the LPR and fought on the side of the AFU, has been sent to court. So what feeds it all? Help, Western help. The West continues to pump up the Kiev regime, militarily and financially. The nomenclature of weapons has become known, which, for example, Germany is going to supply the APU as part of the package it recently announced for 3 billion euros. This is taking into account the catastrophic situation in the German economy. We are talking about 300 guided missiles, Staradars, 15 Leopard tanks, 300 reconnaissance drones, 25 infantry fighting vehicles, 14 artillery pieces, and in addition, 100,000 artillery shells are included in the kit. Sweden is increasing military assistance to the Kiev regime in Stockholm, the 19th and largest tranche of 1.5, even more, 1.6 billion dollars, has been announced since February of the 22nd year. The other day, it became known that Sweden has started transferring the two SS-890 reconnaissance aircraft available to it. One of them allegedly has already arrived in the country and made test flights over the Lviv region in the period from the 21st to the 22nd of April. As far as can be judged, we mean its combined use with the F-16 fighter. Norway plans to increase military aid to the Kiev regime this year by $4.6 billion to $7.8 billion. The money is planned to be spent on the purchase of air defense equipment, artillery shells, drones, strengthening the military-industrial complex of the so-called Ukraine, and building up naval potential within the framework of the so-called coalition of capabilities, which is headed by Oslo and London. The Danish government is preparing to allocate the 25th aid package for $960 million to Ukrainian wards from the 25th to the 26th year. $216 million are going to be allocated for the military needs of Ukraine by the end of the year. Who would you think? Lithuania? Well, there's been nothing wrong with the economy for a long time. It just doesn't exist. So we scraped together what we could. In turn, the Latvian Defense Ministry is going to transfer several hundred reconnaissance drones worth 20 million euros to the Kiev regime in the near future. And all this eloquently testifies to the hopeless desire of European hawks, if not vultures, to help the Kiev regime turn the situation on earth in its favor. An absolutely obviously unrealizable, dead-end ideology. But to do otherwise means to admit the defeat of the ideology of war. And they are afraid of the obvious prospect of Russia's victory. In order to avoid such a scenario, they encourage the Zelensky regime to continue fighting, regardless of the victim, because Ukrainian citizens are dying, and they don't care about them, not like Oslo, London, Tallinn, Riga, Paris, Rome, Madrid. Even their own president doesn't care about them. Well, then, the Kiev regime diplomacy has woken up. We drew attention to the next attacks of the infamous ex-ambassador of Ukraine in Berlin, who agreed to the point that he was simply thrown out of there. Now he was sent on spreads to the UN. It performs these functions. I mean Andriy Melnik. Despite moving to New York, he continues to give business advice. Who would you think? To the future German government regarding the scale of Kiev's assistance. On April 19th, in an interview with a German newspaper, Melnik said that Zelensky's regime is capable of waging war until the 29th year, provided that Germany transfers 30% of the military equipment available in its arsenals, including long-range Taurus missiles, to the APU. Well, Melnik also expects Berlin to legislate the annual allocation of zero as much as 5/10 of Germany's GDP for the needs of Ukrainian militants. According to his calculations, this is about 86 billion euros, and the European Union, together with the seven, should allocate about 550 billion euros for the same purposes in 4 years, according to Ukrainian Ambassador Melnikov. Well, he also has to confiscate Russian assets, provide the Kiev regime with security guarantees, membership in NATO, the EU, and so on. You know, this is, of course, already to the doctor, and not to the UN. But this is an excellent characteristic, and a clear picture of what is happening in principle on the bank. They understand that they only need to blackmail their Western European curators with something. And that's it, and the money is flowing. Here they use this tactic. Hence the growing appetites of the banks regarding the West's military and financial assistance to the Kiev regime in realizing this absolutely unrealizable utopian dream, as they formulated, of defeating Russia either strategically or on the battlefield. Now they don't remember about the battlefield. Well, here's a look at what is happening on the sidelines of world diplomacy. As you know, on April 23rd, the second round of consultations of us representatives with British, French, German colleagues, as well as a delegation from Kiev on the topic of the Ukrainian crisis, was planned in London. But in fact, it was stated that these should be consultations on not so much the crisis as on its settlement. According to Western media reports, it was supposed to discuss some kind of Washington's 7-point plan, which was intended to open the way to a peaceful settlement. On the eve of Zelensky, well, to be honest, apparently after sniffing, categorically refused to make any concessions, and declared legal non-recognition of the entry of Crimea, as he formulated it, into Russia, and defiantly expressed a desire to enter into negotiations only on a ceasefire and only on his Zelensky terms. Such a schizophrenic approach of the Kiev regime has again shown absolute incompetence. Incompetence, irresponsibility, the desire to continue this slaughter to the last Ukrainian, regardless of any victims. Well, why should they count the victims? Why should they consider anyone? Zelensky has not considered his citizens to be people for a long time. We have seen this with the example of the residents of Donbass. Now it has all reached the rest of the regions of Ukraine. And the money is also not his. He didn't earn them. This money is sent to him just like that. Well, of course, for the resources of Ukraine, for natural resources, for land. But Zelensky didn't create them either. In such circumstances, us Secretary of State Mark Rubio and Special Envoy of the American President Stephen Witkoff were forced to cancel their participation in the meeting. They were, for example, followed by the foreign ministers of Britain, Germany, and France. In fact, to call a spade, Zelensky disrupted the London round of consultations, convincingly confirming Bankova's intentions to torpedo the emerging peace process at any cost, just as they had done for many years, mocking the Minsk agreements. Exactly as they did with the 30-day moratoriums on strikes on the fuel and energy complex, exactly as they disrupted the peace talks in the spring of the 22nd year, exactly as they have now violated the Easter truce. Let's read the Western mass media. They continue to publish materials about what is really happening in Ukraine. The April 16th edition of The Economist concluded that the monopolization of power by Zelensky is increasing in Ukraine. Well, as they say, it's better too late than never at all. This is the case. It is emphasized that the usurper Zelensky and some of his inner circle there do not want to share the levers of control with either the government or the parliament. I would like to ask a question to Western journalists who have begun to suspect something. And before that, what plans did Zelensky have? After all, he did not negotiate with Biden, who oversees him, about democracy. When Biden flew to Ukraine and led a government meeting, none of the Western journalists asked the question, what about democracy with the right? What example do the American liberal Democrats show their wards on Bankova? What do they teach them? Isn't this the beginning of the usurpation of power? Isn't this the suppression of the will of the people? Isn't this a disdainful attitude towards any manifestations of legality? No. Then Western journalists applauded 100 times. They really liked it. What a funny, wonderful picture it was. They also rejoiced at how they usurped power repeatedly during the Maidan, how they broke into offices, presidential offices, how municipalities, regional authorities were smashed, those to whom the West gave money in the same way to accomplish this lawlessness, which led to an unconstitutional coup. Now suddenly Western journalists are beginning to see the light and say that it seems like the power is being usurped. With Zelensky in Ukraine, let them bring at least one act of democracy there. Let them show if they can find at least one example of how the law was carried out in Ukraine under the strict guidance of Western curators and the rule of law was maintained. Right now they are emphasizing, I mean the Western media, that those who show excessive independence, enjoy too much support from the population in Ukraine, or have direct access to the leadership of Western countries, have been dismissed or suspended by Zelensky and his inner circle. Excuse me, please, but how was it before, when the legitimately elected president of Ukraine? Do you remember the first Maidan? After the second round, it was outlawed and was held, and it was at the insistence, and with the applause of Western journalists, including this publication, that the third round was announced, in order for the necessary President Yushchenko to pass. And do you remember how during the second Maidan, which was already the last for modern Ukraine within the borders, in which it gained its independence in the 90s? Remember how the crowd hooted, whistled, again with Western money, and demanded that there be reprisals against the legitimately elected president, over the legitimate government, over the legitimate law enforcement agencies, that unarmed tried to stop the crowd from outrages. Where were the Western journalists? Meanwhile, Zelensky, who is rapidly losing popularity, convulsively continues to defend his power, which he has raked under himself, and to protect the political field from potential competitors. On WWII, they plan to urgently pass a bill through the Verkhovna Rada that limits the terms of office of mayors to 2, as it was said there, cadences. This may lead to the removal from office of the mayors of Kiev, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, and other major cities, who have been in their posts for a long time. Thus, Zelensky's regime is gradually establishing total control over the local authorities, preparing for possible political turbulence. I will remind those who are now in Ukraine and are still able to think. Remember how the negotiators arrived in the spring of the 22nd year as part of the Ukrainian delegation. What was done to them there? Yes, some of them were shot. So think about what is going to happen to you now. Through the prism of the regime's self-preservation, the bank's decision to extend martial law and mobilization in Ukraine until the 6th of August should also be considered. And of course, in order to throw firewood into this bonfire, the bonfire of Russophobia, Zelensky announces the next sanctions against 18 legal entities and 130 individuals of Russia. Who needs it? How can this help the citizens of Ukraine solve its problems? Yes, nothing. We need to keep this all afloat. It is necessary to create the appearance of some kind of activity. Who is on this list? Who is declared an enemy of the Ukrainian people, actually? I'll tell you at the end who should have been included in this list. Now I'm going to tell you who is there for absolutely incomprehensible reasons. Here, for example, is the correspondent of the TV channel Russia 1, Alexander Sladkov. Here is the TV presenter Irina Sharapova. And here is Andriy Norkin. And here is the editor-in-chief of the website Ukraine.ru, Iskander Isamov. And who is among the legal entities: International Civil Movement Other Ukraine, TV and radio company Tavria. But this turned out to be insufficient for Zelensky. On the 18th of April, he imposed restrictions on 20 more famous figures of national culture and sports. Now, circus performers, cat trainer Yuri Kuklachev, pop performers Yaroslav Dronev, Nikolay Rastorgev, Alexander Rosenbaum, Garrik Sukachev have found themselves under Ukrainian sanctions. The actors prevented Zelensky. Alexander Pankratiev-Cherny, Evgeny Mironov, Irina Apeximova, Skar Kachira, Vitaly Gakunsky, Nikita Gigurda, the head of the Vaganov, and Nikolai Tsakharidzhy Academy of Russian Ballet, world ballet star Sergei Polunin, rappers, athletes, fencers, gymnasts, boxers. On the same day, Zelensky imposed sanctions against 39 Russian scientists and businessmen, but these are people in general who do not let them live on bank accounts. Who should have opened the list of those who really threaten the people of Ukraine? This list should have been opened by Zelensky, who really destroys the citizens of Ukraine. Commenting on the sanctions of Bankova, Alexander Yakovlevich Shunbaum called them a manifestation, a direct quote, an exacerbation of allergy to everything Russian. Russian banks are clearly becoming uncomfortable with the futility of their own attempts to ban the Russian language and culture. From the desire to destroy the Russian world, here they are trying to do it all, but it doesn't work out. And they speak Russian, and sing songs, and watch programs, and read books. It became just scary on Bankova Street that Ukrainians began to speak Russian more and more often, and our music, and they sing and listen to songs more often too. They also watch films made in Russia there. What are they afraid of on Bankova? That people will begin to see the light. So you, Zelensky, are killing them all there. You will decide what you are more afraid of: the fact that people will start thinking about you, or that you will not have people left, because you are condemning them to certain death. And, of course, in the year of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Zelensky junta in a frenzy, they are increasing efforts to combat monuments to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. The desperate struggle with monuments continues. Yesterday, on April 23rd, a message came about the destruction of the mass grave of Soviet soldiers who fell during the liberation of this very city from the Nazi invaders in July 1944 in Lviv on the Field of Mars. More than 1,500 soldiers and officers of the Red Army were buried there. That's it. I think that the last immoral frontier has been taken. What can happen after that? Officially, the Lviv authorities called these blasphemous actions a direct stat of exhumation work, which it was decided to carry out with the help of an excavator and other heavy equipment. Bandera's handwriting is felt. Couldn't win the fight. They came up with a sneaky way to take revenge on our fighters after their death. But you will pay for it. These facts once again confirm the actual special military operations to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and eliminate threats emanating from its territory. It was stated by the leadership of our country that all the goals set will definitely be achieved. Here's a look. In order to state the real picture, in order to organize the work of the International United Nations, its Secretariat must act. He should be impartial. He should not take any side in any conflict. He has to do his job. And what is the job? Strictly follow the Charter of the United Nations and perform functional duties precisely in accordance with this very document. To facilitate the organization of countries' activities at the on-site, to do everything to ensure that the relevant institutions of the United Nations and its Secretariat work honestly, consistently, systematically to carry out what is prescribed. Well, and report on it. Unfortunately, since the time of the unconstitutional coup d'état in Kiev in the 2014 year, the Unsecretary has consistently acted the other way around and has pursued a policy of double standards regarding the events in Ukraine. We have not heard from the representatives of the World Organization, I mean the Secretariat, criticism of the maiden authorities, when for 8 years a real war was waged by the Kiev regime against citizens in the eastern regions of Ukraine at that time. There were no calls from the UN members for a direct dialogue between Kiev and Donbass, as required by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. Let me remind you that she approved a set of measures to implement the Minsk agreements. No one tried to do everything from the United Nations Secretariat to urge the parties to implement the Minsk agreements and to state the obvious non-compliance by a number of countries, primarily by the Kiev regime, its curator, with what is prescribed. With the beginning of the SVO in February of the 22nd year, the line of Ionovites on the Ukrainian dossier became blatantly biased. It has become the norm for representatives of the organization to consistently hush up blatant violations of the basic norms of international humanitarian law by the Kiev regime, including the use of civilians as human shields, the deployment of military equipment, and the equipment of firing positions in residential areas, torture, mockery of prisoners of war and civilians, targeted killing of civilians. Occasionally, when the data could not be hidden, it was impossible to interpret them in any other way. They pointed to a certain responsibility of the armed forces of Ukraine in violation of international humanitarian law. Very easily, without calling a spade, the Secretariat tone recalled the need to demonstrate the appearance of equidistance. Periodically, appeals for restraint are addressed to all parties to the conflict. This is when infants die. They call for independent investigations, bringing the perpetrators to justice. Again, I emphasize that I do not have accurate information on which side the shelling was conducted and so on. Although they accuse Russia of not committing crimes regularly, and for some reason, in these cases, they have enough of everything, data, and, as it were, facts and emotions. Look at when the production took place in Bucha, when the tragic events took place at the Kramatorsk railway station in April of the 22nd year, or during the evacuation of civilians from the territory of Azov Steel in May of the 22nd, the terrorist attack on the Crimean Bridge in October of the 22nd year. For the inhumane crimes against the civilian population in the Kursk region, after the invasion of the Ukrainian armed forces there in August of the 24th, after the targeted killings of Russian journalists who performed their official duty, both on the front line and on the territory of Russia. No one in the United Nations Secretariat tried to notice anything. They did not try to notice the staging of the Bucha. On the contrary, they told that it was allegedly Russia's fault. But when it was obvious that the terrorist attack on the Crimean Bridge, on which civilians were traveling and were dying, was committed by the Kiev regime because it did not hesitate to take responsibility, he didn't notice anything like that in the Secretariat. The list of atrocities of the Kiev regime, which were left without a proper reaction from international officials, the Unsecretariat, can be continued literally indefinitely. I repeat once again, as practice shows, representatives of the Secretariat willingly pick up information stuffing inspired by the Kiev regime and its Western sponsors, and participate in information campaigns against our country. With enviable regularity, we observe how the Russian side is charged with responsibility for allegedly deliberate strikes on the civilian energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Here is a fresh example: the comments of the press secretary of the Unsecretary General Deus Harek on the April events in the city of Sumy with arguments and fabrications about a series of attacks on Ukrainian cities, which, as he said, led to civilian casualties and large-scale destruction. The UN members are showing themselves no better on the political aspects of the Ukrainian crisis. In particular, the Secretary-General has literally stained himself with a series of biased evaluative statements regarding the well of the population of the Zaporozhye and Kharkiv regions, as well as the Donetsk and Lugansk and People's Republics. According to Gutierrez, a direct quote, the decision to annex, as he said, Donetsk and Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions will not allegedly have legal force, and even agree to the point that it all deserves condemnation. This is the will of the people, a long-suffering people who remember what was done to their grandfathers and great-grandfathers on this earth. The people who suffered from provocateurs and Bandera after the Second World War. And now he is fighting neo-Nazism, fighting for his survival against the background of attempts to destroy people who have both memory and conscience. Is the selective approach of Guterres and other high-ranking officials of the United Nations to quoting the postulates of the UN Charter, to put it mildly, puzzling? It's just some kind of balancing act. The current functionaries of the World Organization forget that their role is to act as guardians of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations in all their entirety, totality, and interrelationship. Here is the principle of territorial integrity, which they regularly emphasize. According to the consensus, let me remind you, Declaration on the Principles of International Law of 1970 is applicable only by a state whose governments observe the principle of self-determination and, therefore, represent the entire population living on the relevant territory. It is obvious that the Kiev regime, which came to power through a coup, does not meet these criteria. He laughs, both Zelensky and the previous ones. The offenders laugh at the fact that they must represent the entire population of Ukraine and must ensure the rights of the entire population. Language writes from the point of view of social rights, human rights, and cannot be engaged in the selection of those who are supposed to speak their native language and who are not supposed to speak their native language. As for the new realities around the Ukrainian crisis, they timidly speak out in support of a kind of Russian-American dialogue on its settlement, but at the same time, they absolutely do not see and do not hear how the same Zelensky mocks proposals for a truce, a moratorium, and so on. Statements about readiness to contribute to possible future negotiations between Moscow and Kiev, if, as it was said there will be a request from both sides. And if, for example, Zelensky's inappropriate behavior continues, then the United Nations, its Secretariat will no longer support the peace process and will again slide into the rhetoric of Westerners about the battlefield and so on. I would like to emphasize once again that officials of the United Nations Secretariat, in a manner characteristic, unfortunately for themselves, which has been formed in recent years, invariably selectively interpret the principle of territorial integrity, in particular of Ukraine. They constantly forget that it is necessary to quote all of this, and accordingly to apply it in combination and in connection with ensuring the rights of the peoples who live on this very territory. It is obvious to us that the behavior of the Secretary General and his subordinates absolutely does not fit into the essence of the letter and spirit of Article 100 of the Charter, requiring the staff of the Secretary of the Etat to observe the principle of impartiality, including the need, direct quote, to refrain from any actions that could affect their position as international officials responsible only to the organization. The actions and statements of the Secretary General and Article 97 do not correspond to the Charter. It secures, let me remind you, for him the role of a direct, quote, chief administrative officer of the organization. The relevant functions do not give the managing director of the Secretariat the right to make biased political statements on behalf of the entire organization, to interpret the norms of the Charter and documents of the General Assembly. Time after time, his wards, subordinates, not only exceed their powers, but actually integrate into the Russophobic front. We regret that unofficials prefer to act as agents of Western propaganda. Well, they participate in this way in putting pressure on the member states. They need to be guided by the letter and spirit of the Charter of the United Nations. Against this background, it is even strange to talk about the potential mediation role of the World Organization Secretariat in the Ukrainian crisis. Well, we were talking about Western support. Of course, it is primarily carried out by NATO countries, because there, in fact, this very logic and plan for its implementation, aggression, war, and slaughter were born. So let's talk in detail about what the alliance is now. All the current activities of the North Atlantic Alliance are aimed at countering Russia and expanding its influence in those regions of the world where NATO members are not located. For what? In order to mess up the situation there as well. NATO, in fact, has returned to the ideology of the Cold War and is increasing its military presence on the eastern and northern flanks. The corresponding infrastructure is being created and expanded near our borders. Priority is given to preparing and repelling the so-called, as they put it, Russian threat. It is known that dense military development of the territories of the member countries bordering with Russia is envisaged. Preparations are underway here for combat operations to create advanced warehouses of weapons, military equipment, and other infrastructure to ensure the rapid deployment of collection forces. I emphasize once again, they don't even hide it, but not some operational intelligence. This is what they claim as a plan of action. For example, NATO combat technical groups are deployed in neighboring Russia and the alliance member countries. Troops and equipment are being transferred from NATO states to the eastern flank. Military contingents of Western European countries are being deployed near our western borders, in the Baltic and Black Sea regions, and the American military presence in European countries is being increased. Let me remind you that more than 100,000 American servicemen and specialists are stationed here. At the same time, about 20,000 were additionally sent there, starting from the 22nd year. The alliance's integrated air defense system is being improved. Announced plans to deploy in the 26th year in Germany, direct quote, on a temporary basis of American medium medium, and shorter-range missiles, including promising hypersonic systems. The NATO ballistic missile defense capability has been strengthened. In the summer of the 24th year, the American Aegis Escher anti-missile complex reached operational readiness in the Redekova settlement of Poland, which supplemented the corresponding facilities in Spain, Romania, and Turkey. On the 14th of January of the 25th year, during the so-called NATO Regional Summit, it was announced that a new mission of the Baltic Sentry Alliance was launched in the Baltic. We have already talked about this. Let me remind you, it is directed. This project, as stated, I emphasize once again, no one even hides it. In order to protect critical infrastructure along the way, NATO members will solve the task of controlling shipping in the Baltic Sea, with an emphasis on the so-called shadow fleet allegedly used by Russia. NATO is striving to achieve military superiority in the Arctic and is increasing its military presence here as well. The region already has about 50 military infrastructure facilities of the United States, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, including 22 airfields, 23 bases, and their modernization is underway. Routes for the transfer of forces and means are being worked out. Advanced equipment and weapons storage facilities are being created in the north of Europe. The alliance is actively developing the territories of new member countries, Finland and Sweden. In these countries, joint events are held with units of the armed forces of the NATO states. The question of the possible creation of a multinational base of NATO's advanced ground forces and other coalition infrastructure in Finland is being considered. This is the same Finland with which we have been peacefully cooperating for all these decades. And there were so many plans. And there were so many things from interstate big projects to cross-border cooperation. That's it. The NATO pause stirred up this too. A potentially peaceful state. Now it is being pumped up with everything, both Russophobia and weapons. In July of the 24th year, on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Washington, an agreement was signed on cooperation in the construction of an ice-breaking fleet between Canada, the United States, and Finland to strengthen capabilities in the Arctic region. The coalition's potential for comprehensive monitoring of the situation in the region is developing, with special emphasis on monitoring the bases of, as you might guess, the Russian Northern Fleet. It is planned to create a comprehensive network of 8 radar stations on the territory of Norway, and the opening of the first one is scheduled for the 25th year. The scale and number of exercises of the alliance, its dreadlocks with a scenario of not only defensive, but also offensive nature are increasing. At the same time, Russia is openly called to the opponents. In the 24th year, the member countries held more than 1,000 training events. The St. Fast Defender 24 collectible complex maneuvers that took place from January to June of the 24th year in Europe became the largest since the Cold War in a series united by a single plan. And the idea is clear. This is a confrontation on the eastern flank of the enemy of NATO. It's clear who it is. Again, our country is called. So in Syria, about 90,000 people were involved in maneuvers united by a single plan, including live firing, with Tanya bombs. They affected the territories, waters, and airspace of most of the European member states of the alliance. The transfer of troops from the United States across Europe was also worked out. Where was the transfer worked out? Exactly to the Russian borders. In the 25th year, NATO also stated that it did not intend to reduce the intensity of military training. Major training events took place on the territory of Bulgaria and Romania from January 13th to February 26th, in Norway from February 4th to February 8th, in the Mediterranean from March 3rd to March 14th. Exercises are planned in the Baltic states and Poland April-July of this year. In the Arctic region, From the 28th of April to the 9th of May, the maneuvers include testing the operational compatibility of units in various operational environments, testing the transfer of troops, scenarios of numerous national and international exercises of NATO member countries in Europe, as a rule, are also focused on a potential confrontation with Russia. NATO has not brought any added value to Europe in terms of stability and security. Everything is exactly the opposite. Its geopolitical expansion to the east has led to a military conflict and the destruction of the European security architecture. NATO's focus on confrontation with Russia, accelerated military buildup, poses threats to our security and to the whole world. Look, the situation in Ukraine, provoked by the West, has led to tectonic shifts in the global economy, logistics, food security, and information security. Countries still cannot adequately respond to what was created by the hands of the Biden administration and executed by the Kiev regime. Look at what is happening now, what is happening on the European continent, in its western part, the risks of incidents that can escalate into a direct armed conflict, with the most tragic consequences for Europe, and I repeat, for the whole world, are increasing. And all this against the background of rewriting history at some simply cosmic pace, and, of course, unleashing the real Russian neo-Nazi ideology. It's as if this terrible genie is deliberately released from the bottle in order to completely zombie people in the EU and NATO countries. The creation of new dividing lines imposed by NATO militarization does not contribute to strengthening security in Europe, but creates enormous risks. This is to the question of the fact that we are constantly being called aggressors, here and there, then on the pages of the press, then on television in NATO countries. I have cited irrefutable facts of who is actually engaged in militarization with aggressive, destructive, immoral goals. By the way, we also talked about Finland today. There were a lot of questions. I repeat once again, for decades Russia has been building relations with Helsinki, Finland, the country and the people, based on mutual respect, pragmatic cooperation, political dialogue, trade, culture, joint projects in energy, logistics, millions of border crossings. My God, and how many joint marriages and families have been formed over the years. All of this seemed to be the unbreakable foundation of good neighborliness. It also seemed that Finnish colleagues appreciated this approach. There have been different things in history. And now, finally, there is everything for long-term peace, mutual understanding, and cooperation. I remember former President Saul Niinisto praising, direct quote, clear, direct dialogue with Russia and assuring that there are no problems in relations. From our side, it definitely wasn't. And so after the start of a special military operation, which, and Helsinki knows it perfectly well, was a response to the project of extermination of Russians and Russian speakers on the territory of Ukraine provoked by the West. So after that, Helsinki instantly turned into a mouthpiece of an anti-Russian Russophobic company. Mr. Niinisto, who once talked about the mutually beneficial cooperation, suddenly started talking, direct quote, about war crimes, aggression, loss of trust. It seemed that all the previous good neighborliness was for the Finnish elite only a forced smile through force. They say they tolerated, as they say, a dangerous neighbor, because supposedly geography obliges. The new President Alexander Stupa, an ardent Atlanticist, continued this absurd spectacle. Then he threatened direct quote, to support Ukraine to victory. Well, it's hard to put anything against me here. I think he meant that he would support Ukraine until Russia wins, until the last Ukrainian, probably. However, he can't say this directly. Then, he praised the Finnish volunteers who went to fight against Russia. Then, he suddenly said that it was time for the Finns, direct quote, to mentally prepare for the restoration of relations with Moscow. I don't know. Maybe Tuba's position was beneficially influenced by a round of golf at the Mar-a-Lago estate back then. In an interview with a Finnish socio-political magazine on April 16th, in response to a request from journalists to somehow clarify Helsinki's position on the prospects for building relations with Moscow, Stop changed his rhetoric again. He said that in relations with Russia, it will be possible to build something there only after peace is achieved in Ukraine. My God, when will they start quoting Zelensky, who tells them that he is not going to build any peace? He does not need anything. He does not plan any political process. But Stupa did not tell the Finnish journalist about this, and accordingly, the Finnish audience. At the same time, he made a reservation that all this is possible with the understanding that bilateral relations will not return to the previous level, and accused Russia, you will not believe it, of imperialism inherent in it at the genetic level. I didn't know that Mr. Stupa is also a geneticist, and if you are not a geneticist, then let them remember that those who in Western Europe reasoned about racial superiority based on genetics, without having a specialized education, finished poorly. He began to say that the Finns could not accept it for a very long time to trust Moscow. It turns out that the president of Finland has stopped seeing future relations with Russia, even doubted the expediency of bilateral economic cooperation, not because of the EU sanctions, but simply because the Russian economy, you know, is very small. Right now, I would like Mr. Stupa to tell me about the size, for example, of the economy of the Baltic states, or what are the latest news from the economic fronts of Germany and France? What about the economy, for example, in Portugal? Where is the logic, Mr. Stupa? Then the language of power. Then it's time to restore the relationship. Then the relationship will never be the same. This is some kind of, you know, not politics, populist porridge, and fear of your own voters, whom your predecessors. And now you have confused, if not deceived, such an absolute inconsistency of positions and paradoxical practical actions of the Finnish state leadership in relation to our country leads, unfortunately, to inevitable consequences. It is quite obvious that as a result of the collapse of the entire complex of mutually beneficial cooperation with our country, due to the fault of the Finnish authorities, Finland has lost disproportionately more than it has gained, if it has gained anything at all, except problems. Finland's security has not increased as a result of the country's accession to NATO. On the contrary, the financial burden associated with the need to increase military spending has increased. The crisis phenomena in the economy are obvious because of the crazy, suicidal sanctions policy of the European Union. The atmosphere of military psychosis is cultivated in the country. From the severance of economic ties with Russia, Finnish economic operators are forced to leave the Russian market. Under pressure again from the official authorities in Finland, continue to make multi-billion-dollar losses. Citizens of our countries are deprived of the opportunity to see their relatives and friends on the other side of the border. This unsightly list of the results of the anti-Russian policy of the current Finnish leadership can be continued. The irony is that the Finnish authorities, having destroyed many years of cooperation, themselves admit, direct quote, there is little left of the previous relationship. So continue this phrase, and tell me from whom and why. But instead of analyzing their own mistakes, they continue to blame Russia. It's convenient, well, apparently well paid. The question is being questioned. Who benefits from turning Finland into a springboard of confrontation, especially against the background of what NATO is doing now? And we have discussed this topic in detail today. The answer is obvious to those who are used to warming their hands on other people's conflicts. Everyone benefits from it. All this is beneficial to provocateurs. others, those who have a painful aggressive logic, who endlessly, despite the mistakes and lessons of history, use the ideology of superiority of some over others. Now, about our country. Russia has always been ready for dialogue and has repeatedly demonstrated in practice. And this is the potential. But after all, dialogue requires sincerity, not double standards, meanness, and provocation. So far, the Finnish leadership has demonstrated only one thing: complete helplessness in defending its own national interests. It is a pity that ordinary Finns will have to pay for the mistakes of the Finnish leadership. Japanese militarism. We regularly inform you about the facts of the crime of this shameful phenomenon for the world. In the year of the 80th anniversary of the victory, we would like to provide new information on the topic of crimes of Japanese militarism during the Second World War, which, according to many, and, as you have repeatedly stressed, do not have a statute of limitations. The procedural actions aimed at punishing all the perpetrators continue to this day. The Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation has officially notified of the resolutions adopted in December of the 24th year and in January of this year on the cancellation of earlier conclusions on the rehabilitation of 10 Japanese citizens. Their names will be posted in the text version of the briefing. These persons will be exchanged for participation in sabotage and espionage activities, as well as in the commission of ordinary crimes. According to the results of the review of court decisions and court decisions in the cassation and supervisory instances, it was established that these persons are not subject to rehabilitation. Their guilt has been fully proven. As you know, Myanmar was shaken by a powerful, destructive, extraordinary event, an earthquake. On the 28th of March on the territory of the Republic. This earthquake crushed, well, literally cities. It was the most powerful earthquake in the last 95 years, with a magnitude of 7.7. Was it caused by the large-scale destruction of infrastructural social facilities, mainly in the administrative region of Shagai, in the cities of Mandalay, Epido? As a result of the earthquake in Myanmar, according to official data, 5,106 people were injured, more than 300,700 people were killed, 129 were missing. According to the Russian embassy in Yangon, there is one Russian among the Mandalay dead. He worked as a teacher at a local high school on behalf of the President of Russia, as part of the provision of humanitarian assistance to the friendly Myanmar people. 5 Il-76 aircraft of the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Russia, with the necessary equipment for search operations, arrived in this country on March 29th, March 31st. Among the countries that sent their rescue teams, the Russian Consolidated Detachment of 264 people. He was the most numerous. It consisted of employees of the Airmobile Squad of the SPA Center, the Center for Special Operations and Special Risk Leader, Sinological Calculations, anesthesiologists, psychologists. A temporary hospital has been deployed in the city of Manila. Other teams of emergency pediatric surgery and traumatology have also arrived in Myanmar. This is the clinic of Dr. Leonid Rochel, and 4 doctors from the Republic of Kalmykia. In total, the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Russia carried out 10 flights to Myanmar. 157.5 tons of humanitarian aid were delivered. These are tents, mobile power plants, food, basic necessities. The doctors of the squad of the Center of the Savior resuscitated 2 people who were taken to an airmobile hospital with cardiac arrest. The specialists of the Ministry of Emergency Situations of our country found 1 victim extracted from the rubble alive, as well as 37 bodies of the dead. 130,000 square meters were examined for finding people under the rubble. The doctors of the mobile field hospital provided medical assistance. More than 500,000 citizens, including 94 children, underwent 68 surgical operations of varying complexity. The chairman of the State Administrative Council, the Prime Minister of the Republic of the Union of Myanmar, Mina Online, during a visit to the location of the Russian rescuers in Mandalay City, expressed gratitude for the help in eliminating the consequences of the earthquake. The work of the Russian search and rescue teams was highly appreciated by international organizations, in particular the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And more about world diplomacy. Today, on the 24th of April, the world community celebrates the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. It was established in accordance with the resolution of the UN General Assembly 73 Fraction 127 of December 12, 2018. It was introduced on the initiative of Venezuela on this day and this day itself. It is intended to remind of the importance of collective efforts of states to resolve global problems, prevent conflicts, and strengthen peace. Among the modern challenges are international terrorism, extremism, drug trafficking, organized crime, cyber threats, information wars, climate change, a new pandemic. It is possible to cope with these threats that undermine international stability only by coordinating the actions of the members of the international community, who must be united by the awareness of common responsibility for the fate of present and future generations. The United Nations plays a special role in these efforts. Since its foundation, it has been a unique, irreplaceable mechanism for building interaction between states today, and thanks to its universal legitimacy, which, unfortunately, is being undermined by the Western minority, but still holds for now, thanks to his exceptional competence and maximum representation, he is able to make a decisive contribution to the maintenance of international peace and security, the promotion of human rights, and the right to socio-economic development. Of course, the UN Charter is of key importance for the full realization of the potential of the world organization. This document is rightly considered the cornerstone of the modern world order, which is again being subjected to attempts of destruction by the world minority. The Charter, it was considered a code of conduct for all states. The goals and principles set out in it are designed to ensure peaceful, harmonious coexistence, and the postulates of the Charter are an integral system and must be strictly enforced, but observed in their entirety. And, as we have already said, and are saying today, this is a constant relationship. Unfortunately, the unocentric system of international relations has recently been in the deepest crisis. The reason lies in the unilateral actions of certain Western countries, which have come to believe in their own exclusivity, infallibility, and are increasingly using numerical advantage in the UN Security Council to push through solutions that are beneficial to them. In the General Assembly, Westerners are using unscrupulous methods to mobilize support for their destructive endeavors. They have actually usurped the organization's secretariat, and we have discussed this in detail today. They turned him into a conductor of the interests of the collective West. And let me remind you again, the minorities of the world. The concept of the so-called rules-based world order, conceived by Westerners, is aimed at revising the international legal architecture and forming alternative decision-making mechanisms, bypassing the UN. As a responsible member of the world community, Russia consistently advocates strengthening multilateralism, primarily by restoring the authority and central coordinating role of the United Nations in international affairs. An increasingly significant place in the collective efforts is occupied by the group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. It has proved its effectiveness in promoting the interests of the world majority and countering Western attitudes. We call on all countries to adhere to multilateralism as an integral element of a lasting and just world order, to develop cooperation based on the principles of equality and compliance with the norms of the UN Charter. An important date. I remember the legendary meeting of Soviet and American troops on the Elbe River. Her 80th birthday will be celebrated tomorrow, April 25th. After all, it has become a symbol, one of the most important symbols, of the defeat of Nazi Germany by the combined forces of the anti-Hitler coalition. It was on this day, marking the highest point of the military alliance of our country and the United States in World War II. The wars of the two armies shook hands on a damaged bridge in the city of Torgau, the spirit of Elbe, After all, it's not just an expression anymore, it's practically a proper name. This is a clear example of how Russia and the United States can put aside contradictions, build trust and cooperation, in the name of a common goal, in the name of a common noble goal. Remember these lessons of the past. It is especially relevant now, when attempts to rewrite history and, as they formulated it, Biden's vultures, to abolish all Russian, have acquired the character of a dominant trend in some countries of the collective West, of the world minority. But, I assure you, it is impossible to undo the feat of the Soviet military liberator. We do not forget about the common aspiration that united our people in those years with the Americans, about the terrible hardships, about the huge losses we remember and will always remember. Against this background, it is gratifying that certain good traditions are being restored. The current American authorities have agreed to the Russian embassy in Washington a commemorative ceremony on April 25th, in honor of the meeting on the Elbe, about a memorial plaque at the Rington Cemetery, in the context of the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the victory. Other actions are also being worked out together with American veterans. In all of this, we see a positive difference from the previous US administration. Let me remind you that Biden's ideology has been introducing over the past 3 years unmotivated bans on such contacts and celebrations. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that the meeting on the Elbe exhibition is open in the main building of the Victory Museum on April 23rd. It shows world-famous photographs, in particular, the meeting of the commander of the reconnaissance group, Lieutenant William Roberts, and the platoon commander of the 173rd Rifle Regiment, Lieutenant Alexander Silvashka. Visitors to the museum will be able to see a unique map of your war, presented by an American officer of the Guard to Petty Officer Sigankov. It reflects the path of the Allies in Europe towards each other. The exhibition also presents awards, documents, drawings, mutual gifts and souvenirs, weapons, military uniforms of Soviet American officers, which reliably create or even recreate images of allies, and sincerely bring us back to those moments, to those times when soldiers rejoiced at the connection of the fronts, the imminent end of hostilities in Europe. The exhibition is complemented by fragments of newsreels. This newsreel is the result of the work of frontline cameramen who attended these meetings. The exhibition will last until the 18th of May. We invite everyone to get acquainted with it. We will definitely place links to the relevant website in the text of today's briefing. A year ago, again at our meetings with you, we talked about a school volunteer project to create an audio guide to the memorial of the Ravensbrück concentration camp, Germany. To our great joy, this initiative is alive. We congratulate you on another success in the initiative group. 70 school children, students and teachers of German from 11 cities of Russia, 3 universities and 13 schools, translated into Russian and voice documentaries about the Dachau concentration camp, and an audio guide to the memorial of the Soloskils concentration camp. These are participants from the Amur and Orenburg regions, Yekaterinburg, Yelets, Lugansk, Moscow and Penza, St. Petersburg, Tambov, Tyumen, Yaroslav. At one time, the project manager Elena Simpionova drew attention to the fact that there is no Russian translation of a documentary about the concentration camp in the Dachau Museum. Let me remind you that it was in Dachau, at the SS Hebertshausen shooting range, that more than 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war were brutally shot. 92 Red Army soldiers, members of the camp resistance, were also shot in Dachau in 1944. They were part of the Fraternal Union of Prisoners of War. The union organized resistance in various concentration camps, conducted underground work, and rescued comrades. The project participants translated and revoiced the film about Dachau in Russian. The film is available on a special website, where volunteers publish the results of their work for the second year. Of course, we will definitely place the link in the text of today's briefing. As part of the second project, school children and teachers translated and voiced in 3 languages an audio guide on the memorial of the Lost Spills concentration camp. These are Russian, English, and German language variants. The text for the audio guide on the Spills memorial was prepared based on the materials of historian Vladimir Bogov. He has been researching Nazi atrocities on the territory of the Spis for 10 years. Let me remind you, the concentration camps are Salo Spills, and not, as the NATO members call it now, a labor camp or something else. This is a concentration camp, not a slow Spills labor camp. I mean, for many years Vladimir Bogov literally opposed the paradigm that was introduced into the minds of the alleged Soviet occupation and actively imposed on society by the Latvian authorities. His widow, the director of the Authentic History Foundation, Maria Boga, compiled a text for the tour and gave it to school children and teachers for translation and dubbing. The audio guide contains critical remarks of the historian regarding the modern exposition in Sal Drunk. We thank all the people who are not indifferent, involved in the projects, school children, students, I repeat again, teachers, sound engineers, historians, translators. We hope your work will continue. We will always help in any way we can. On the 25th of April, the International Patriotic Action Dictation of Victory will take place all over the world, under the motto, To Know, to Remember. It is a historical dictation on the events of the Great Patriotic War. The Dictation of Victory will traditionally be held at regional venues throughout Russia, abroad, as well as in an online format. On the Dictation of Victory website point of the Russian Federation. Of course, this link will also be duplicated in the text of today's briefing. But if you do not have time to write a dictation on the 25th of April, do not worry. It will continue to be available for passage on the website of this project. A cycle of online training tests is already starting to prepare for the Dictation of Victory. They will help users to check and refresh their knowledge of the events of the Great Patriotic War. All questions compiled by professional experts, historians of the Russian Historical Society. Each text has its own theme. I mean, each test has its own topic. It is dedicated to important dates, famous commanders, military operations, and other significant events of the Great Patriotic War, although if there are insignificant events in the Great Patriotic War, we invite everyone to test their knowledge. And on April 30th, the Vietnamese people, all the friends of Vietnam, including, of course, Russia, will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the south of this country. After the declaration of independence of Vietnam in September 1945 year, France, not accepting this, unleashed a war. It ended in 1954 with the shameful defeat of France, and soon on the region on targets, and the United States of America. Their intervention resulted in a direct armed conflict, the longest and bloodiest after the Second World War. In the course of this aggression, the Americans brought down a huge amount of ammunition on the recalcitrant Vietnam. They used napalm. Those who do not know, and now I do not even know, unfortunately, that they do not see this in practice, unfortunately, because this is a fact of history. Many people don't know what it is. Look, we will give a link to this in the text of the briefing. All this was passed by the citizens of Vietnam. Many residents of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam are still experiencing the consequences of the use of the infamous agent rank folio. Despite all the power of the US military machine, the heroic Vietnamese people survived and won. He defended his right to independence, to independent development, to his identity. We have always been proud of the fact that our country made a significant contribution to this victory, as well as to the recovery of Vietnam's economy in the post-war period. We heartily congratulate our Vietnamese friends on this glorious date. We are sincerely pleased with their impressive successes in the economy, social sphere, strengthening their authority in the international arena, and are determined to continue mutually beneficial cooperation in various fields. April 24th, 110th anniversary of one of the most tragic events of the first half of the 20th century, the Armenian Genocide. In the Ottoman Empire, Russia has always perceived the grief of the fraternal Armenian people as its own. Russian Imperial Army's Caucasian Army opened the Russian-Turkish border by order of Nicholas II and saved at least 350,000 Armenians, according to historical evidence. In 1915th year, Moscow's position on those events is well known. It is consistent and based on humanistic traditions. Already in 1915th year, at the initiative of Russian diplomacy, its head Sergei Dmitrievich Sazonov, leading members of the international community qualified what happened as, direct quote, crimes against humanity. Modern Russia was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire. The State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation in 1995 and 2005 adopted a resolution condemning the Armenian genocide in 1915, 1922nd years. In the 2015th year, the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, during his visit to Armenia, took part in the ceremony of commemoration of the victims and expressed sincere empathy for the Armenian people. Traditionally, many memorable events are held in many Russian cities, including Moscow, with the participation of not only representatives of the numerous Armenian community, but people of different nationalities. They are all united by the desire to preserve the memory of the sorrowful events of the past and to prevent their oblivion for opportunistic purposes. Another announcement: the Gromyko Association for Foreign Policy Studies, together with MGIMO, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, the Institute of Europe, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the Academy of Management under the President of the Republic of Belarus, opened the reception of applications for the Gromyko CIS Young International Students Competition. The competition is being held this year. Original unpublished scientific articles, analytical notes of individual authors or groups of authors under the age of 40, devoted to the study of a wide range of topical international problems, including modern geopolitical processes, prospects for integration in the post-Soviet space, threats to international security, the role of the UN, the issue of preserving historical memory, combating the falsification of history, are accepted for participation. The project, let me remind you, has been implemented since 2000 with the support of the Interstate Fund for Humanitarian Cooperation of the CIS member states, and during this time, it has brought together about 3,000 young researchers of international relations from 11 countries. This year, the qualifying round takes place until the 16th of May, and the forum of the finalists of the competition will be held on the 23rd and 24th of July at the sites of the Institute of Europe of the Russian Academy of Sciences and MGIMO of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. Presentations of analytical reports of young specialists will be held within the framework of the event. The award ceremony, of course, will take place for the winners of the competition. To participate, it is necessary to submit an application via an electronic form on the official website before, I repeat, the 16th of May of this year, attaching the participants' questionnaire and the competitive work. Again, we will duplicate all the links in the text of today's briefing. From the 8th to the 13th of May, Moscow will host the 10th Anniversary International Festival of Folk Song of the Vision 2025 this year, as well as, I think, not even thousands, probably tens of thousands of events, are timed to coincide with the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War. And what is a ghost? This is a unique cultural project. Who became its initiators and when? In May 2000 of the 14th year, it was initiated, and this initiative was made by hero of the Soviet Union, cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova, people's artist of the Soviet Union, hero of labor of Russia Joseph Kobzin, State Duma deputy Oleg Nilov. The festival is aimed at preserving and developing folk folk song culture, and at the same time, at popularizing folk traditions, promoting true spiritual and moral values. Every year, an increasing number of bright, outstanding collectives and solo performers who perform in the genre of folk song and folk dance are attracted to participate in the festival. The geography of volunteering covers almost all regions of the Russian Federation, as well as near and far abroad, including China, India, Serbia, Moldova, and many other countries. And all this contributes to the strengthening and development of cultural ties in a real, non-opportunistic, not so on occasion. Imagine, because since the 2014 year, this tradition is not just alive, but also to what levels it has developed. This year, the WWII Song Contest will bring together more than 1,000 talented artists from Russia and abroad, and the events will be held at the best venues of the Russian capital. The main venue will be the State Kremlin Palace. It is there that the State Academic Cuban Cossack Choir will perform. I'm sure everyone has heard, but this is something altogether. Russian Folk Choir of Omsk State Academic Russian Folk Choir named after Pyatnitsky. And the first event of the festival will be the presentation of the People's National Prize of Voluntary 2025. On the 9th of May, concerts for participants of a special military operation will begin in hospitals, in military units, on landfills. Such performances will last until the 13th of May. I would like to especially note that in order to support the fighters of a special military operation, a voluntary Donbass project was launched back in the 22nd year. Within its framework, hundreds of performances of frontline concert brigades were organized, including directly in the zone of a special military operation. On the 11th of May, the participants of the 2025 Volunteer will perform at the outdoor venues of the Moscow Season City Festival on Tverskaya Square and Revolution Square. This year, thousands of participants, I emphasize, are scheduled to perform. It is on the 11th of May that the Consolidated Choir of Dobrovini will open the 10th anniversary festival. During the day, folk choirs, ensembles, soloists, harmonicists will perform famous folk songs and, of course, popular victory songs. Also on this day, the shooting of the program and the Edge of Harmony of the Beloved with the participants of the Vision will take place. On the 13th of May, on the final day of the festival, the concert will be held in the hall of the church cathedrals of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. Dozens of academic choirs and folklore ensembles will demonstrate their choral art. It is expected that the 10th Dobrovodini Festival will become a bright event of the cultural and social life of Moscow and the Russian Federation. The participation of foreign performers in it will serve to expand cultural ties, friendly and partnership relations with the participating countries of the festival. Exchanges on deer and song culture contribute to the development of intercivilizational dialogue and strengthen mutual understanding between international. We invite everyone to attend these events. Russian and foreign media are invited by the organizers to participate in these, it seems to me, about enchanting concerts. So, I'm ready to answer your questions. International life.
Yes, hello.
Good afternoon.
The other day, the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said, as she put it, about the queue of countries for cooperation with the EU. Let me quote, "In an increasingly unpredictable global environment, the state is lining up to work with us." How would you comment on this statement?
You know, the funniest thing is that she said that the world is, or it is obvious that we are talking about a situation that she characterizes as a more unpredictable global situation. Who created it? I would like to ask Ursula von der Leyen a question. Didn't she contribute? Isn't it her Western predecessors? Wasn't it the member countries of the European Union and NATO countries that staged this orgy, including since the 2013-14 years, when first they themselves, including from Germany? So let them ask their German colleagues how they organized the Maiden in Ukraine with their hands. First provoked the internal Ukrainian crisis, then they began to impose sanctions, which ricocheted, so to speak, around the world, and then, in fact, hit them as well. And then they plunged Ukraine first into the abyss of civil war, slaughter by the Kiev regime against the southeastern regions, and then turned it all into an international massacre. Who is making the world, as she says, more and more unpredictable? Yes, she does. Now about the cues. In this case, she spoke, first of all, as I understand it, about global trade and economic changes and trends. Miss Feuderlein, speaking about cues from countries wishing to work with the European Union, apparently gives wishful thinking. I'll give her concrete facts. The European Union is far from what it was 20 years ago. The reputation as a comfortable partner, as a reliable jurisdiction for business investment, has been hopelessly undermined by them. To a large extent, this is the anti-service of Ursula von der Leyen herself, the use of illegitimate unilateral sanctions, the theft of foreign assets, the wildest Brussels corruption, the rejection, contrary to common sense, of economic expediency, of Russian energy carriers, and a number of other positions at adequate prices. All this indicates the unreliability of the use Brussels as an economic counterparty. This is all supported by the desire of the European Union to impose additional levies on its partners under the pretext of combating climate change, for example. Remember the plans to launch the so-called border carbon correction mechanism, or, for example, measures to combat, as they say, deforestation. These are all hidden extortions. If we talk about the role of a safe haven, then this is also no longer the prerogative of the European Union. Its economy has been storming for a long time. I can give visual confirmations and examples, and we give them regularly. This is a drop in industrial production indicators. This is the closure of enterprises operating in energy-intensive industries. This is the transfer of production abroad. This is an aggravation of the problem of energy poverty. She's a German citizen as far as I remember. At least it has something to do with the Germans, that they don't tell how they transfer their industrial production, their companies and firms abroad. What is the queue for Brussels? This queue of EU companies is going to other countries to re-register their business, industry and production, because they are fleeing from the economic collapse in the European Union. She can't help but know that. She knows and lies. I think that other countries of the association cannot ignore these realities. Of course, they take all this into account when building relations with the Congress. Another thing is that the whole world is trying to figure out how to get out of the most difficult economic situation, which in the first place has become, perhaps because of the destructive actions of the world minority, who set out to rule the universe without attracting the attention of nurses from other galaxies. Everyone understands this. All this is taken into account when working. In the current economic turbulence, it is quite natural for states to promote the interests of national business, look for alternative markets for their goods, build new production chains, and in this case, the expansion of contacts between countries that are trying, I say again, to overcome the economic difficulties created by the West is natural. Only, this is not the logic of the fact that there is a queue lined up in Brussels. The EU is seen rather not as a long-term, strong and reliable partner like Ursula von der Leyen, but as an exclusively intermediate stop. And let's look at the numbers on the numbers. The share of the BRICS countries in purchasing power parity by the end of last year, this is just an example, has already exceeded the Group of Seven indicator by almost 7%. What conclusions can there be about some cues? Who does the seven consist of? Here, please, is the answer to the question. It's just that, they don't want to voice it all on the basis of facts, because the facts don't speak in their favor.
Thank you very much. One more question. Today, we have already touched upon the topic of financing the Kiev regime. And so, on April 18th, an exchange of notes took place in Kiev between representatives of Japan and Ukraine on the allocation of a loan worth about 500 billion yen to the Ukrainian regime. If I counted correctly, there's about $350 million there. And repayment at the expense of special income, the so-called, in quotation marks, naturally formed from the management of frozen Western countries of Russian state assets. How would you comment on this story?
As you know, we have been warning the Japanese side for a long time that participation in illegitimate experiments with sovereign assets of the Russian Federation in any form, even in the role of an intermediary who performs a purely technical function, will be considered with us as complicity in theft. That's the way to talk about it. Knowing about the Russian approach, Tokyo's representatives constantly tried to justify themselves, provided us with some additional explanations through diplomatic channels, and the bottom line boils down to the fact that we are supposedly not talking about the main capital, but about interest that is outside Japanese jurisdiction. In addition, again, the alleged Japanese loan is only 6% of the total 7-point package, agreed in October of the 24th year. Here is another such so-called clarification, received literally on the same day when the aforementioned exchange of notes between Japan and the Kiev regime took place, namely on April 18th. Tokyo cynically expressed hope that these actions would not have a negative impact on relations with Russia. Well, you'll excuse me, of course, if they think that the logic of both ours and yours applies here for half a ruble with the beach. They were mistaken. We are forced to disappoint. Such actions will certainly and inevitably have a negative impact on relations with Russia. We regard such a step as extremely hostile, as treacherous. It is unacceptable neither by legal nor by universal concepts. Japanese attempts to give any mitigating explanations on this score are inappropriate. Unless Tokyo wants to announce an increase in the national debt to our country by the same 500 billion yen, which is about $3 billion US. I don't know. Then let them specify. Any transfer of domestic reserves or profits from them to the Kiev regime is considered to us as complicity, I repeat, in the crimes of this junta, and will inevitably entail tough practical countermeasures, including asymmetric ones related to those areas of Russian-Japanese relations where bilateral cooperation is still warm, and the responsibility for the further degradation of bilateral relations still lies entirely with the administration of Cigar and Saiba.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ria Novosti is with us. Yes, hello. Maria Vladimirovna. Hello. If I may, we have two questions today. Christina Lana Rodriguez News. I recognized you. Yes, thank you very much. Are you me? And I'll tell you. That's fine. All right. We'll find out, if I may. Two questions, and the first question. Yesterday, the FSB of Russia stopped the activities of the ex-employee of the Security Information Service of the Republic of Moldova, Mr. Rusnik. He arrived in Russia to collect information of a closed nature about the plans of the Russian leadership in relation to Moldova, employees of law enforcement, and other state structures of Russia involved in foreign policy activities in the Moldovan direction, against the background of Chisinau's hostile policy. How can such actions be assessed? And will the Moldovan ambassador be summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry? You know, you used the wording of my answer in your question. Indeed, this is another manifestation I mean, such actions that were detected and suppressed by the FSB of Russia are another manifestation of the hostile line of the Moldovan authorities towards our country. The forms of diplomatic response to such things, one of which is the summoning of the ambassador, are determined taking into account all the circumstances of the case. We do not always inform about this. If there is information that we can share, we will definitely do it. It is noteworthy that the most official Chisinau constantly and always without evidence, as we regularly report to you, accuses Russia of interfering in the internal affairs of Moldova. They do it in every way. You can see how in the pro-government media of Moldova, all these espionage passions are being unwound around. For example, even our embassy in Chisinau, 3 weeks ago, 3 employees of our diplomatic mission were expelled under a far-fetched pretext. Sandu's regime also started having some kind of espionage seizures there. We then responded in a mirror way, and now it turns out that the Moldovan special services themselves are collecting intelligence on the territory of our country. Well, here's proof for you that everything that is happening on the part of the anti-Russian Sandu is hypocritical, false. All this is being done specifically to sever relations between our countries and complicate the lives of our citizens, to do everything to rewrite the history of our countries, our joint history. Here is another example. Thank you very much. If I may ask the second question, of course, on the topic of Moldova. On April 22nd of this year, the Moldovan authorities actually demonstrated that they were once again distancing themselves from the celebration of Victory Day. Instead, the country intends to officially celebrate Europe Day. How could you comment on this? You know, they are distancing themselves not from Victory Day, they are distancing themselves from conscience. And moreover, it seems to me that they have already increased the distance between themselves and conscience so significantly that I am not sure that they will find it. She'll just get lost. But at the same time, such things are no longer surprising. Officially, Chisinau is firmly embedded in the use line of rewriting history, glorifying the Nazis, praising collaborators. After all, this is all accompanied by a ban on literally everything related to the Great Victory. Do you remember how in the 22nd year, the Moldovan authorities banned the wearing of the saint, George ribbon, other symbols associated with the holiday of the film about the Great Patriotic War? Then it was under the pretext that, as it were, the symbolism of the saint, George ribbon is connected with the symbolism of a special military operation. They don't seem to support it, and so on and so on. But no. Now they are already erasing the holiday itself from their history. This is a holiday of the Moldovan people. This is a celebration of those veterans of Moldova who paid with their lives for the victory, for the future life of future generations. It's their holiday, the Sandu regime steals, and this is not related to any special military operation, not even related to Russia. This is due to the fact that they systematically and cynically destroy the population of Moldova. They do it economically, they do it politically, and they do it ideologically. It just gives them pleasure, I mean the Sandu regime, to mock their own veterans. It's just a perversion of some kind. And, of course, this is what we are talking about now. This is only part of the absolutely anti-people course of the Sandu regime. It is aimed, globally speaking, at dismantling sovereignty, history, and national identity, at their dissolution in the European neoliberal cauldron. For what? So if she's a Romanian citizen, if she renames the Moldovan language Romanian, if she calls Moldovans Romanians, and legislatively fix it all, it is clear that now we need to dock with Romania. And fourth, this we need to deprive Moldova of its own identity. And the victory is the great patriotic war. Veterans prevent them from doing this, because this is something that will not fit into the history of Romania. This is the history of Moldova, the Moldovan people and their history combined with our common history. It's their own story, and it needs to be broken, it needs to be distorted, it needs to be erased, so that the docking, and this is not a docking, it is literally a sacrifice by the Moldovan people for the sake of Romanian ambitions. And accordingly, this very hellish plan goes according to the scenario that is so generously paid for. But this, I repeat again, is not the only fact that confirms this very anti-people course of Sandu. Let's take a few more examples. The authorities are trying to manipulate one of the most sensitive topics for the Moldovan people, religious. On the 17th and 18th of April, Archbishop Markel of Belsky and Valoursk was twice groundlessly refused to fly from Chisinau Airport to Israel for the Holy Fire. But this is some kind of demoniac. But this is just some kind of cynical humiliation and insult to the feelings of believers and, again, the history of the people of Moldova. In Moldova itself, this was regarded as blasphemy, as a mockery of the feelings of believers. Fortunately, in the end, the Holy Fire was delivered to the Moldovan land on behalf of the Moldovan metropolis of the Russian Orthodox Church. On April 20th, the Ministry of Justice of Moldova published a post on one of the social networks, in which the Easter holiday is called, direct quote, constitutional and useful for the public spirit, and the cakes, direct quote, comply with the legislation of the European Union. Yes, I probably forgot to say, it's April 20th, 2025 year. If maybe someone thought that these were formulations from a century ago. No, it's now. Moldovans reacted with a flurry of indignation, criticism, ridicule. After that, the publication was deleted. Can I delete this post? And how can I get my conscience back? Nevertheless, this episode demonstrates the logic of all the actions of official Chisinau. Anything that does not comply with the directives of Brussels will be uprooted. Some Moldovan experts bitterly add that if necessary, Moldovans themselves will be uprooted instead. So it's already happening. These are no longer Moldovans from Sandu's point of view, they are already Romanians. An integral attribute of the project, which is called European Moldova, is, of course, its anti-Russian charge. It manifests itself in literally everything. Again, an example of the 18th of April, insinuations about a certain Russian social network called Matryoshka appeared in the Moldovan media space, which was cleaned, as you know, from independent media. Allegedly, its activities are aimed at discrediting the Moldovan authorities. No social network or any phishing network can discredit the Sandu regime more than my Sandu herself. Residents are now being inspired with thoughts about the corruption of the management of managerial insolvency, repression against the opposition. To do this, you do not need to create any nesting dolls or other social networks. Moldovans, on the other hand, see that no social networks inspire them with anything, and they themselves are trying to talk about topics that concern society, and they are not allowed to do this in any incomprehensible, non-existent social networks, but on their own television channels. The policy of forcible Europeanization of Moldova leads to the opposite effect. Because it is not connected with any Europe, Moldova is already Europe. What does the Europeanization of Moldova have to do with it? Moldova has always been part of the European continent, but since we know that everyone who is recruited into their ranks by the Brussels bureaucracy in the member countries and non-member countries must necessarily not know geography. It just has to pass the test. Then, apparently now Moldovans will be inspired with the idea that they have never been Europe, but now they need to Europeanize. They are Europe. How can I not Europe? Where else can they Europeanize? If it's about economic standards, then let him eat his own standards. Put them in order. According to a public opinion poll published last week, more than 40% of the Republic's residents continue to see Russia as an important partner in the economic sphere. And, by the way, this is very significant in terms of security too. At the same time, the European Union considers only 29% of respondents as applied to the economy, and less than 20% as far as security is concerned. And this, I emphasize once again, against the background of a total sweep of the information space, when only pro-Western media operate, work. And such money is being spent on these very pro-Western media that it seems to me they could raise the Moldovan economy to a new level with these funds. We perfectly understand what Sandow is doing, but we can also say that she will not be able to rewrite the people of Moldova, friendly to Russia, into another quality, into another category. We were friends, we will stay, we interacted, and we will interact. It's all absolutely temporary, malicious and anti-popular, what the Sandow regime is doing. Thank you very much, Marina. Thank you. Is the news with us? Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon. Yes, hello. Ekaterina Pozarskaya, Izvestia. We're going to have one question. Last week, the Latvian parliament approved a law on the country's withdrawal from the Zatava Treaty banning anti-personnel mines. Before that, in March, the defense departments of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Poland recommended to the leadership of their states withdrawal from the agreement. What can the relevant initiatives of European countries talk about? Well, we have already commented on this. I can repeat once again that according to our data, the recent joint statement of the Baltic countries and Poland on withdrawing from the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Production and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines, and on their destruction, the so-called Ottawa Convention, is aimed at developing cooperation with manufacturers of these products from the United States of America. All this has been done, of course, in the interests of NATO. The Baltic countries and Poland should become the place of organization of large-scale production of such ammunition, and funds will be allocated through the European Union, including the Europe program. This technical assistance in this area will be provided by the United States of America. It is planned to use them to create minefields on the eastern flank of NATO. All of this will be used for the supply of the APU. And instead of taking measures to reduce tensions, the Baltic states and Poland continue to pursue a course of confrontation with our country to escalate tensions on the European continent. After all, they are specially rewriting history, so that none of the current generations knows and cannot remember how such adventures ended earlier. Those who make such decisions in Western Europe, in Poland, in the Baltic states, should understand that the security of Europe cannot be built on the ruins of common sense, and it is impossible to cultivate the fruits of peace and cooperation in fields filled with mines. Playing with fire at the borders of the largest nuclear power is fraught with the most disastrous consequences for security on the European continent. And most importantly, they reveal real provocateurs in themselves by such actions. Thank you. Thank you. Lee Bolt News is with us. Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. Good afternoon. Now I'm sorry, I have a technical problem here. I can see and hear you perfectly. Ask a question. Yes, now, just a second. Yes, Maria Vladimirovna. The Lithuanian parliament has extended national sanctions against Russians and Belarusians until May of the 26th year. The law is supplemented with a provision that a residence permit issued to a Russian citizen in Lithuania will be cancelled if it is established that he has traveled to Russia or Belarus more than once within 3 months. Maria Vladimirovna, how can you comment on this? As you know, police and totalitarian regimes have been formed in the Baltic states today. For them, segregation of citizens living on the territory of countries on the basis of nationality has long been the norm. Moreover, it is the norm not only of political and public life, but also of state policy, and being one of the most active supporters of Kyiv Russophobia, in particular, Vilnius purposefully tightens the screws on Russian-speaking residents, doing everything possible to, well, literally expel them from the country. Russia will persistently seek to condemn this Russian practice, including on relevant international platforms. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is Xinghua with us?
Yes, good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna, correspondent of Sinwazan Yuli. We have such a question for you today. On April 20th, Chinese Language Day was celebrated all over the world. And in many places in Russia, various events were timed to coincide with this event, at which such types of traditional Chinese culture as graffia, ryazan with paper, wushu and so on were demonstrated, which the public met with great enthusiasm. And in recent years, more and more people in Russia have shown interest in the Chinese language and Chinese culture. How do you assess this phenomenon? And we know that you are fluent in Chinese. What do you think about the role that Chinese language teaching plays in Russia, the relations between our two countries? Thank you.
As you know, education, in particular, teaching and learning of both Russian and Chinese languages, has a special place in Russian-Chinese humanitarian cooperation. One of the first, as you know, cross-years of thematic international projects, and this has already become a good tradition of holding them, was dedicated to national languages. So in 2009 year was, the year 2009 was declared the year of the Russian language in China. The year 2010 was declared the year of the Chinese language in Russia. And since the year 2005, a corresponding intergovernmental agreement has been in force between our countries. On its basis, the parties not only encourage mutual teaching of Russian and Chinese, but also actively support cooperation in improving teaching methods. This area of interaction is an important component of bilateral relations, plays an invariable role in strengthening both trust and friendship. But you have absolutely rightly noted in Russia that interest in Chinese culture, Chinese literature, and the study of the Chinese language remains at a very high level. In China, more and more young people are also interested in the Russian language. Our countries play a leading role in preserving world stability, security, preserving traditional values, values of civilization, preserving historical memory, and with the dynamic and progressive development of bilateral relations, comprehensive partnership, and strategic cooperation in all areas. This includes politics, economics, the state, the humanitarian sphere, and the scientific and technical sphere, and the demand for professional personnel who speak Russian and Chinese is growing, because there should be more specialists who should ensure the development in these areas and the deepening of our cooperation in these areas. Young people in our countries who choose to study Russian and Chinese have every reason to be confident in good prospects in the future, in broad opportunities for self-realization, and, of course, relevant work is being carried out through the relevant departments to create favorable conditions for progressive advancement and inter-university cooperation. increase academic mobility, exchange of best practices in the field of personnel training. A total of 29 joint educational institutions based on Chinese universities are already operating in China. More than 100 educational programs with Russian participation have been opened, and the Russian-Chinese Joint University in Shenzhen is successfully operating. Of course, we share with our Chinese friends the position on the importance of preserving and caring for the national language. I am convinced that such memorable dates as Chinese Language Day, which is celebrated on April 20th, and Russian Language Day, which will also soon be celebrated on June 6th, I remind you of the importance of multilingualism, cultural diversity, and contributes to the support and development of the language as a national treasure, a means of international communication, and an integral part of the heritage of world civilization. Let me remind you that our languages are not only a part of our rich cultural history in a national capacity, but they are also the official languages of the United Nations. So, thank you very much. Thank you. Is Reuters with us?
Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon. Reuters is with you. We have two issues related to Ukraine. Last Friday, the Bloomberg News Agency reported earlier this week that the United States offered its allies, as part of a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, the de facto recognition of Russia's control over Crimea and the 4 territories that became part of Russia. Not Ukraine's accession to NATO, easing of sanctions against Russia. And by and large, this can be regarded as a concession to Moscow's demands. But within the framework of the peace process, is Moscow ready to make any concessions within the framework of possible peace agreements? If so, what kind of concessions could these be?
You know, we can go back to the history of the issue now.
Мы можем с вами сейчас опять удариться в историю вопроса.
But for this, it is probably better not for me to voice these theses, but simply to remind that, for example, Sergey Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, gave an interview to the Kommersant newspaper just a week ago, in which he elaborated on this topic in detail. Or to remind you how it will be almost a year soon, how exactly in this hall, the President of the Russian Federation voiced not the Russian negotiating position, but the Russian basic approach to the situation around Ukraine and in general security on the continent, respectively, and in the world, probably as a whole. It will take us a lot of time, so I will definitely duplicate the links again in the text of the briefing. Let me just remind you that all our approaches are outlined by both the President and the Foreign Minister in detail and are regularly reconfirmed. Therefore, I think we need to concentrate now on today's reality, which has already taken place in the form of the fact that similar plans that were voiced in the media, in the form of leaks, or links to conversations with some diplomats there. Already all this is complex, and leaks and failures and plans and so on were rejected by Zelensky. But why should we build a hypothetical scenario with you again, when a maladjusted or even inadequate person, if you can still call him that, took and said that according to Bulgakov's novel The Dog's Heart, he disagreed so powerfully, so to speak, he answered. He said that Kiev legally, Zelensky said, does not recognize the Russian status of Crimea. I don't even want to quote him, I just want to draw the appropriate conclusion. He again, Zelensky, demonstrated the lack of political will for peace, unwillingness to make concessions on the settlement of the conflict, and this should be called differently. In simple terms, he demonstrated his inability to show mercy, not care, towards his own citizens, citizens of Ukraine. This should be the main thing when we talk about the current situation. He doesn't care what happens to them. He is only interested in one thing, his political ambitions. Because if someone says, no, he probably thinks not about his political ambitions, but about the political future of Ukraine. So now is the very moment when this is the future of Ukraine, and it could be formed, guaranteed, secured. But that's not what he needs. People are expendable for him. He is interested in maintaining power. Personal ambitions are painful, given his inadequate condition. Well, and everything that comes from it. You have tested 2 or 3 sources. I think there were hundreds of such sources and leaks there. Therefore, it is useless to comment on all this. The dialogue with the American side continues. As you can probably see, it is not easy, but at this stage, our countries are focused on finding long-term solutions. Our management also spoke about this again. We hear the same signals from the other side. Again, if you want to clarify the issues of status and concessions, I will return you to the speech of the President of the Russian Federation on June 14, 2024 year, and emphasize that this is not a request position. This is a basic position. Let me also remind you that the people of the regions you mentioned, as I said again today, have fully realized the right to self-determination of peoples enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Therefore, we just need to proceed from the realities, from international law, from the situation on Earth. How many years have we been pushed to the idea that everything should be decided on Earth? This is now a factor. So it is necessary to proceed from this.
Thank you very much. And the second question, if I may.
Elimination of threats and the root causes of the conflict, and so on. I emphasize once again, I will not repeat all this. This is stated, among other things, in an interview with Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov in the Kommersant newspaper, although it is regularly stated. But it is so large-scale once again. Again, it was done on the pages of this publication.
Thank you. The second issue is again related to Ukraine. Russia consistently opposes Ukraine's membership in NATO, calling such aspirations one of the causes of the conflict. What is the current position regarding Ukraine's possible membership in the European Union?
Why are you so concerned about membership issues? Maybe it's better for you to think about the penis. He is there in general, potential or current, I mean Ukraine, not in the best condition. That's why there is such a desire to speculate hypothetically somehow. Look at what is happening with Ukraine. The second point seems to me that the West, as a guarantor of the development and well-being of Ukraine, apparently, such, you remember, such statements were given to them, and such promises were publicly voiced. It is precisely the collective West that must answer to the Ukrainian people what they have dragged Ukraine into and what they have done with it. Were guarantees given that Ukraine would be a prosperous country? Let them answer all these questions before the Ukrainian people. And a very important point, when you talk about the European Union, it does not even hide that it has changed. And this modification did not happen with a change of name, although, probably, it can now be assumed that there was a certain political component in this too, when the European Economic Council turned into an economic union, putting or removing the economy from the name, respectively, from, apparently, the number of priorities. Look at what the European Union is doing. He is primarily engaged in politics. The economy is pushed back. The economy does not even serve politics anymore. The economy is being blackmailed by politics within the European Union. The second point, but let's see what's left of the economic component. After all, this is an economic component that is not related to minimizing damage to the member states of the European Union, but, for example, is related to raising funds and financial assistance to the Kiev regime itself in order, again, to return to politics as the dominant of the European Union, to influence the situation in the region, on the continent, and so on, and so on. More and more in recent years, even before the 22nd, we have observed the mimicry of the U in one of the NATO departments. And now this is already evident in practice, when the North Atlantic Alliance uses the European Union as such a purse, as an opportunity to use financial flows under the guise of some kind of assistance. Yes, just to mobilize the economies of the member states of the European Union to serve the aggressive policy and aggressive ideology of NATO. From all of this, we also draw the appropriate conclusions. If you have everything, then go ahead. Is the Media Corporation of China with us? Yes. Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. We have one question today. The results of the latest Pew Research Center poll show that Americans' negative perception of China has declined for the first time in 5 years. This may be due, among other things, to the growing number of American users in Chinese social networks, streaming of American internet stars. The analysis also shows that 52% of respondents believe that President Trump's tariff policy will harm the interests of the states, while optimists of this policy make up only 24%. So, in your opinion, does the US tariff policy negate itself in this context? You know, to be honest, I would like to build an answer here to a greater extent, not on economic indicators and not on tariff issues, but on information issues. The fact is that xenophobia, well, you say that the share of negative perception of China and the Chinese inside the United States is decreasing. This is xenophobia, which is now changing for the better. Americans, according to you, are beginning to perceive China and the Chinese less aggressively, less biased. So you need to remember that these were unnatural processes associated with, one might assume, some kind of aggressive role of China in relation to the United States, which did not exist, or with some historical phobias, or the unresolved nature of some complex issues coming from the past or arising in the present. Nothing like that. Xenophobia in the United States has been created. It was created systematically, as well as Russophobia, as well as phobias against other countries. If you think that, for example, in relation to its allies, the United States does not know how to create these phobias, you are mistaken. I have given an example several times. I'll bring it again. Then, when France, pursuing its independent foreign policy, refused to join the American adventure of occupying Iraq and overthrowing its authorities, not even the authorities, but the destruction of statehood, then France was declared another kind of scarecrow, appointed another scarecrow inside the United States of America. And an information campaign has been launched against France and the French. It was disgusting. It was not that terrible. It was disgusting when American talk shows discussed how to rename French fries. French fries in English in the States are called French fries, French fries. They really discussed that it was no longer a humorous show, it was a real discussion about what was better after everything that was happening. France, let me remind you, has allowed itself simply not to violate international law, not to use words related to France, the French language, French culture. There were problems of French films in the States. The French were ridiculed, and so on, and so on. Do you understand? This is an artificially created negative perception of a particular nationality, nation, country. I remember very well how disgusting some elites or circles behaved in relation to the same Kazakhstan when the film pejoratively was released on the territory of the United States. Not even ridiculing, but pejoratively referring to Kazakhstan, to its culture. But in fact, there was just some kind of mixture, some kind of terrible fusion of humiliating and inadequate attitude towards a number of peoples, under some common slogans, memes, and so on. And there was nothing anyone could do. It was just some kind of a craze. I don't even remember what it was connected with. It was terrible, because all the cinemas were plastered with such posters, and no one could do anything. Because it was called freedom of speech, or freedom of expression, and so on. Do you understand? In other words, these are all artificial things that appear apparently well paid, well directed for some specific purposes. Either to create negotiating positions, or to destroy some economic plans and projects, some more, or apply pressure. Well, that is in different ways. Therefore, first of all, we must remember that we are talking about a shameful phenomenon, information companies against people of different nationalities, different ethnic groups, different citizenship, which, unfortunately, for the collective West is, alas, but literally commonplace. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is the IRNA news agency with us?
Hello, thanks. Please let
News agency, if you don't mind, I will ask a question in English. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araki said that Iran is ready to hold trilateral meetings of Iran, China and Russia, and include other issues in the negotiations. Could you comment on the attitude of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to this issue? There is constant close coordination between Russia and Iran on a wide range of international topics of mutual interest. First of all, this concerns cooperation with the United Nations, the IAEA, other organizations, and other multilateral platforms, including the BRICS and the SCO, approaches to regional affairs, specific cooperation projects, and promising areas are regularly checked to combine the efforts of Moscow, Beijing and Tehran in order to effectively contribute to the formation of a reliable infrastructure of a multipolar world, ensuring sustainable global development, overcoming the urgent challenges faced by the modern world. We proceed from the interest of our three countries in progressively building up the relevant consultations, which continue at various levels both between the capitals and within the framework of specialized forums. In such forms where Russia, China, and Iran participate. If that's all, then the next question is, Lee News is with us, the front. Yes, hello. Let me ask you one question. At the beginning, we talked about the topic related to this, but a specific event. Recently, another mass pilgrimage of the Japanese leadership, including more than 70 members of parliament, took place to the Syrian sanctuary and Yasukuni in neighboring countries. This caused sharp discontent. In particular, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea published a harsh comment. And how would you comment on a particular event given? Well, you know, we have already talked about Japanese militarism today. So the temple and Sukuni is an odious symbol of this very Japanese militarism. There, among others, class of war criminals are preferred. They were sentenced to death, again, by the verdict of the International Tribunal for the Far East. As far as we know, on April 21st, Prime Minister Ishiba, and also the chairman of both houses of the Japanese parliament, acting members of the cabinet of ministers, sent sacrificial offerings to the aforementioned temple. Well, in general, all this is obviously not devoid of pomp and some kind of solemnity. We strongly condemn this practice, which, in the year of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, looks simply odious. It has been repeatedly stressed that Tokyo thereby hurts the feelings of the peoples of neighboring countries who suffered from the barbaric expansionist campaign and aggressive policy in the first half of the 20th century, which was led by Japan. This action clearly demonstrates the essence of the current course of the Japanese authorities on accelerated remilitarization. At the heart of this course is the unwillingness to take responsibility for unleashed aggression and the lack of sincere repentance and repentance. We once again call on Tokyo to stop trying to whitewash the inhumane pages of its own history and fully recognize the results of the Second World War. Thank you. Thank you. With us, Ice Moscow Post. Yes, hello. We have one question today. There was information that Russia is working on the creation of international settlements based on gold parity. How do Russia's BRICS partners view the possibility of creating a single currency with gold collateral? As you know, as part of the accelerated fragmentation of the world economy, the main task for many countries is to provide conditions for the sustainable development of the economies of their own states, countries, associations. The new geopolitical reality literally dictates the need to develop effective measures and further steps to increase financial and economic cooperation. You understand, the same de-dollarization, which is obviously now becoming a global trend, was announced by the US administration under Biden. After all, it wasn't the countries that refused to use the dollar in mutual settlements, but this Biden administration personally cut off countries from the possibility of using the dollar for settlements. This is an absurdity that the current US leadership is paying attention to now, but it was the Biden administration that set the tone, started, and, so to speak, apparently in general, I do not know if I thought it through or not, but certainly introduced de-dollarization to the masses. Let me remind you that I have been closely following the statements of the Russian leadership on this matter. Among other things, a number of statements were made during the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Russia said that it had never abandoned this tool, but when it was snatched out of our hands and blocked altogether, yes, and it was done with some special frenzy, so to speak, by representatives of the Biden administration. Then just two other mechanisms began to be used to pay, live, and develop.
просто для того, чтобы рассчитываться, жить и развиваться, начали использовать другие механизмы.
It was strange
Странно
to
все это
watch
было
all
наблюдать.
this,
Ну,
but she did a
мало
lot of
странного
things,
наделал Байден, ведь
Biden,
это
and all this
американская
American liberal Democratic
либерально-демократическая
Party.
тусовка. А,
Therefore, now all this is being done in order to.
Сейчас все это делается для того, чтобы
Or it is better to say that all this is done because of distrust of the financial mechanisms created by Western countries, based on how Western countries themselves apply these mechanisms. And in this regard, not only the BRICS member countries, but also a number of other states are striving to create reliable systems that would guarantee them from shocks, I say again, which, for example, in particular, were created by the American liberal Democrats. The main focus of attention of the participating countries is now aimed at creating conditions for the widespread use of national currencies in mutual settlements. The task, of course, is not easy. Structural reform of the global financial system is a matter of not a single day. However, all the countries of the association are determined to achieve practical results and are ready to increase cooperation in this area, realizing that in the obscurantism that the Biden administration arranged, it is necessary to find points of support for survival, for development, for normal life. Work on building payment mechanisms that are resistant to external risks, primarily based on the use of national currencies, has been underway for a long time. The preliminary results were reflected, as you remember, in particular, in the Kazan Declaration. It was adopted following the results of the BRICS Summit, which took place from the 22nd to the 24th of October of the 24th year. This document lists a number of specific projects. Among them is a cross-border payment initiative, settlement and clearing infrastructure institutions and reinsurance companies, as well as a new investment platform, and they are aimed at creating favorable conditions for the growth of trade and investment between the BRICS countries. We hope that their implementation will continue this year under the auspices of the Brazilian presidency. Thank you. Thank you. Lean News is with us. Ru.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Edition of Less Than Earl Greater Than News. Mikhail Rosen, we have one question.
Yes.
According to media reports, this week the Consul General of Russia in Gyumri Igor Titov visited the local office of the Mother Armenia movement of the opposition bloc. Is this information reliable, and to what extent is Russia ready to develop relations not only with the government, but also with other political forces of Armenia?
The meeting you are talking about is part, by the way, an integral part of the daily work of the heads of our foreign institutions. Russian diplomats communicate with representatives of the entire spectrum of political forces of a particular country. For what? In order to promote bilateral ties in various directions. And in the case you mentioned, Igor Borisovich Chitov, on the eve of the celebration of the great victory, invited the leadership of all political forces, the Council of Elders of Gyumri, to take part in a solemn reception at the Consulate General. The issues of developing cultural contacts of the municipalities of the consular district with Russian partners were discussed. You know, I have seen various publications on this subject, about some kind of domestic political context. There is definitely no domestic political subtext here. Everything is open, and everything, in my opinion, is extremely consistent with the goals and objectives of opening a foreign institution.
Thank you, Maria Vladimirovna.
Thank you for going further with us, whether Greater Asia. Maria Vladimirovna, hello. Yes, we have one question today. In recent years, Moscow has hosted 3 visits of a high-ranking delegation from the Middle East at once. First, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araki visited the Russian capital and conveyed a personal message from Talik Mini to Vladimir Putin. Then the world of Qatar also visited Moscow and met with Putin, and then Sultan Ahmed arrived. Does such high activity of the Middle Eastern states indicate that Marshall, which is a strategic partner of Iran, acts as a key strategic mediator in the dialogue between Washington and Tehran in the context of resolving the entire situation around the Iranian nuclear issue? Well, I have already partially commented on this today. We, I mean Russia, are making active efforts to prevent another serious deterioration or another crisis around Iran and its nuclear program. Our position in this regard is that we consistently, categorically exclude any attempts by individual countries to seek a solution to emerging issues through the use of military force, and we strongly warn all those who are thinking about it not to embark on such a path with serious consequences and even, I would say, shocks for the entire Middle East region. It seems that all sensible neighbors of Iran, including the Persian Gulf state, understand this perfectly well. Like us, they are interested in the endless escalation of tension, which has been diligently escalated with the West for many years, under the pretext of several imaginary threats related to the Iranian peaceful atom, not escalating into a hot phase, but being removed through reaching agreements that properly take into account the legitimate rights and eliminate the mutual concerns of the parties involved, and, of course, the prospect of a settlement around the Iranian nuclear program on a substantive and regular basis. Again, I have already said today, is being discussed with Tehran by the Russian side. This topic is present in our dialogue with many other countries, including Qatar, Oman, mentioned by you. The Russian side supports Muscat's efforts to establish an indirect dialogue between the negotiating teams of Iran and the United States of America. Bilateral relations with Iran, as well as with other international partners, as you understand, are not limited to one single topic. Their agenda is much deeper. Negotiations have just taken place in Moscow. They were covered in detail during a press conference. You can read it again. The agenda is based on a solid foundation and historical ties, coupled with many diverse trade, economic, scientific, technical, cultural, humanitarian, and other cooperation projects that are developing dynamically and meet mutual national interests. But once again, I draw your attention to the detailed presentation of the approaches by the foreign ministers of Russia and Iran during a press conference following the talks in Moscow. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is there a star with us? Yes. Good afternoon. Maria Vladimirovna, my name is Racine Bodrova, Zvezda TV channel. Unfortunately, another sad news has touched our editorial office. Our colleague of the military commander of the Star, Nikita Golden, died from his injuries as a result of the Afu strike on the 24th of March. A young guy, unfortunately. The doctors fought for his life for a whole month, but they could not save him. How would you comment on this ongoing hunt by the Kiev regime for Russian journalists? Well, first of all, we express our deep condolences to the family and relatives of the deceased. Tonight it became known that on the 22nd of April, Nikita Golden, the military commander of the Zvezda TV channel, died of severe wounds received as a result of a targeted rocket and artillery strike of the Afu on the 24th of March. For almost a month, doctors fought for his life, but the injuries were incompatible with life. I would like to remind you that Nikita Golden, along with Izvestia's correspondent Alexander Fedorchik, the operator of the Andrei Panomo TV channel, the driver of the film crew Alexander Sergey, has already become the fourth victim of the shooting of the film crew using high-precision HIMARS missiles of American production. The very fact that the Ukrobanderovites did not spare to scarce missiles at once to attack a civilian car with unarmed journalists excludes the random nature of the attack. These terrorists, and there is no other definition for them, well, probably only except as inhumans. They knew who they were hitting. And they knew that they were hitting journalists. I would also remind you that since the beginning of this year, only since the beginning of this year, 5 journalists have been killed as a result of targeted attacks and APO: Alexander Martymyanov, Alexander Fedorchuk, Andriy Panov, Anna Prokofieva. Today, right now, on this day, Nikita Golden. Many media employees were injured in various degrees of severity. These are Maxim Romanenko, Mikhail Kivkev, Svetlana Larina, Isabella Aliberman, Yuri Shumev, Mikhail Skaratev, and Dmitry Volkov. In total, the victims of such terrorist attacks are counted by dozens. Just think about it. This is not the statistics of the decade. It's just over these months, a few years. And all these tragedies are not the result of a random combination of circumstances. These are brutal premeditated murders and attempts on life under aggravating circumstances. And the Kiev regime is hunting correspondents and journalists with the hands of its neo-Nazi militants. They specifically hunt them down. They specifically attack with all available weapons. They do this not only on the front line, they do it in the center of peaceful cities, blowing up Dugina, blowing up Vladlina Tatarskaya. And we will not allow these other bloody crimes of the Zelensky clique to get away with them. As you know, the investigative authorities of our country are taking all necessary measures to bring the perpetrators to justice. And we, diplomats, on our diplomatic front, will seek from the leadership of relevant international organizations and human rights structures a proper qualification of their atrocities. This primarily applies to the Director General of UNESCO, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media. We will raise these issues on all multilateral platforms and draw the attention of the wider world community to them, in particular, in connection with the World Press Freedom Day celebrated on the 3rd of May. We will raise this topic during the upcoming meeting of the Committee on Information of the UN General Assembly. It will be held on the 28th of April to the 9th of May. The perpetrators of these terrorist attacks and those on Bankova who conducted and introduced such practices into everyday life should clearly realize that the reckoning for these murders is inevitable. Well, actually, you won't return their children and journalists to the mothers. Then, why talk about it? No, we don't just need to talk about it. We need to talk about it with facts on hand at all international venues, because we are writing their names into history. If we don't talk about it, if we slow down the pace of our work for at least a day, even for one day, they will be wiped out of history. In this story, there will be only those who should stay there, and they won't be seen, they won't be recognized, but our diplomats, our permanent mission to international organizations, our permanent representatives personally, our ambassadors, our diplomatic and consular staff will not allow this. We hold exhibitions, we prepare speeches, we distribute reports, we do everything to ensure that our journalists have the opportunity to participate in international conferences themselves. We literally regularly tell the story of our domestic journalism, which is now struggling with these global fakes in practical terms. Not only in theory, holding conferences and symposiums somewhere, you need to talk about how to counteract lies and misinformation. But this is how our journalists do it. And accordingly, we will bring information about them, about their feat, about their tragic, very hard work to the world community in all possible ways and fix it in the documents of international organizations. Thank you very much. Thank you. Lena Down is with us. Yes, hello. Maria Vladimirovna, Elena Tislovin, Anadolu Farm Agency. But today, there are two questions. How would you comment on the statement of the Yemeni Houthi movement that civilians are being killed as a result of the intensifying US attacks? You know, our assessments of the large-scale military operation launched by the United States against the Yemeni Ansar Allah movement. You are aware of them. They have been repeatedly brought to the general public, and they are formulated in a message to the media on March 15th, among other things. It is dedicated to a telephone conversation between Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I repeat, the Russian side firmly believes in the need for an immediate cessation. Violence calls on all parties involved to exercise restraint, to avoid any steps fraught with further escalation and expansion of the zone of armed confrontation. We are convinced that the way to ensure long-term stabilization in this region of the world and a lasting settlement of the protracted Yemeni crisis lies through negotiations aimed at developing compromise solutions to existing problems acceptable to all, with due consideration for the legitimate interests of all leading Yemeni political forces, including the Ansar Allah movement, and now as for the strikes by the US armed forces on the Ras Isa oil terminal on the night of April 18th. According to the latest data, they led to the death of more than 80 and the injury of about 230 people. We consider such actions unjustified and unacceptable, or in this regard, to draw your attention to the statement of the Secretary General Gutierrez, published on April 19th, in which he expressed concern about the American attacks on Ras Isa, which caused numerous civilian casualties. He also noted that 5 humanitarian workers were injured. He pointed out that serious damage had been done to the port infrastructure and expressed concerns about the possibility of contamination of the adjacent sea area as a result of an oil spill. For our part, in coordination with our regional partners, first of all Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Iran, we will continue our energetic efforts to normalize the situation in and around Yemen as soon as possible. Thank you very much. And the second question concerns the Iranian nuclear deal. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov said Moscow is ready to help the United States and Iran restore the nuclear deal. How does Russia see its role in this process? And what could it do in this direction? First of all, I have already commented on this today. Secondly, I said that detailed comments on this matter were given following the negotiations during a joint press conference. We will definitely duplicate the links in the text of the briefing, including the briefing from the 9th of April. I can confirm once again that Russia is ready to assist in solving this problem and reaching mutually acceptable agreements between the parties, but I have already said a lot about our practical work today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is the author and publication with us?
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna, Ruslan, publication author. And we are with you. We have 2 questions today. The countries of Scandinavia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark are militarizing at a record pace this year. In other words, we are talking not only about the military budget, but they are buying powerful weapons. Probably, what it will lead to and why it is being done are rhetorical questions. But I would like to ask you what the Foreign Ministry is doing, what it can do, in order to at least offset the risks that we predict in the future.
I commented on this topic today in the context of the general NATO destructive efforts. I have talked a lot about Northern Europe, but I can add that the Russian side is closely monitoring the military preparations of Western Europeans, including the Nordic countries, the forced integration of Finland and Sweden into NATO. Such processes were actively going on long before the beginning of their membership in the North Atlantic Alliance. They were only hiding behind a special military operation, its beginning. In fact, we had already talked about the docking of military planning and regulations, and so on. And they drew the appropriate conclusions. The decision to join the North Atlantic Alliance in Helsinki and Stockholm was made by the authorities of these countries, again filled with such Russophobic complexes without, as you remember, conducting thorough consultations with their own public under obvious pressure from the outside. They all began to criticize referendums in other countries, and they do not criticize their own because they conduct. Therefore, it is simply impossible to call these decisions balanced, deliberate, or completely sovereign. It has been repeatedly stated, taking into account the above-mentioned actions of our once good neighbors and former partners, Russia will use all available means to ensure its security and defense capability against the background of the aggressive aspirations of the NATO bloc. Many solutions have already been announced, and they are being consistently implemented, and as for our country's diplomatic efforts in this direction, frankly speaking, we have long and seriously doubted the ability of the military political leadership of many Western, in particular North European countries, to adequately perceive the signals we broadcast about the inadmissibility and danger of escalation of tension in the Baltic and Arctic regions common to us all. Because we hear absolutely, as I just said on the example of Staub, some kind of ragged rhetoric, within which he constantly contradicts himself. In order for a diplomat and diplomatic tools to be used truly effectively, it is necessary, among other things, that the appropriate reason signals are at least communicated and at most perceived. Today's political elites in Copenhagen, Oslo, Stockholm, and Helsinki refused such communication with us. They declared their doctrinal goal, as they put it there, to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. If we talk about diplomatic signals, it is quite obvious that the receivers in these capitals are tuned exclusively to the purity of aggression, to the purity of madness broadcast from Brussels, to the purity of such Russophobic frenzy broadcast by London. Until recently, they received signals from Washington quite well.
Такого русофобского угара. Ну, до недавнего времени они неплохо принимали сигналы из Вашингтона.
Now, for some reason, they have started crashing on this frequency again. In general, they don't know what to do. It seems to me that Washington music is being temporarily silenced. Apparently, well, let's see what happens next for them. What does this mean about the loss of sanity and the loss of their own sovereignty? Until such a paradigm changes, the prospects for conducting a substantive and mutually respectful diplomatic dialogue with the Northern Europeans aimed at achieving practical results are not visible because of us. As I said, we have always been ready for dialogue. There's something going on with their radars and antennas.
Thank you. And the second question. The representative of the Georgian Dream Party suddenly announced that Georgia is fully ready by the year 2030, and, moreover, will join the European Union. How can we comment on this, and how will the relations between our countries change?
You know, the main thing is that those who aspire to join the European Union by the 30th or some other years have somewhere to join. Secondly, just remember, there is nothing good Britain would not have come out of. That's where there is something to profit from, where there is really, so to speak, potential, the British will be the first. Now they are the first to leave the European Union. It is clear why. Because the crisis phenomena inside the European Union are so obvious, and their potential is already so predictable, that there is nothing to do, therefore those who think about their national economies.
Что делать там нечего тем, кто думает о своих национальных экономиках.
That's it. Therefore, this is a sovereign matter for everyone. Georgia, and I have repeatedly talked about this. despite the existing political differences and the lack of diplomatic relations. But we are building bilateral ties in a mutually beneficial way, and a dialogue is underway in this direction. We are striving to intensify business and humanitarian cooperation. We are systematically working towards normalization of relations, which meets the interests of the Russian and Georgian peoples. And our aspiration, our goodwill, and our desires have already shown this in practice. But the question is that those who consider the European Union should look at the numbers, not only on slogans, but on specific figures. You never know where they write, so to speak, on fences. We need to see if it's really there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Whether the tape is with us. Through.
Yes, hello, Maria Vladimirovna.
Good afternoon.
We would like to ask one question. On April 21st, the newspaper for the New York Post, citing sources in the White House, reported that behind the scenes, Ukraine agrees to make concessions to Russia as part of a peaceful settlement, but demands that all these concessions take place de facto, and not de jure. How does the Russian side assess such information and similar messages?
I have just commented, answering a question from Reuters, that the Kiev regime has already denied all this. Why return to this topic? The question rests on the fact that the de jure, de facto Kiev regime is incompetent and inadequate. That's the problem. So let's move on. With us is the magazine of compatriots' revenge.
Yes, Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon.
Hello.
On the territory of the EU, the information about Russia is monstrous, and you are tragic from the point of view of bringing the truth about Russia to the Western man in the street. A strong argument in favor of Russia, its attractiveness, would be the wide publication of statistics on the resettlement in Russia of not only compatriots, for example Soviet Germans, but also German Germans, indigenous inhabitants of Western countries. Unfortunately, different numbers are wandering around the internet. Could you provide such official statistics on important positions of the country, the period of quantity?
As you know, over 1,200,000 people took part in the state program to assist the voluntary resettlement of compatriots living abroad to the Russian Federation for the period from 2006 to 2023 years. These are people from more than 50 countries. These are our compatriots from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Germany, and the United States. For example, if we talk about Germany, over the past 5 years, more than 15,000 ethnic Germans have moved to the Russian Federation. This includes German citizens. In 2024 year, that is, last year, about 30,000 people arrived under the program, 1/7 people. About 2,000 of them are from the countries of the European Union, Germany, 700 people, Latvia 600 people. Now about the repatriates, because these are different statistics, and you are absolutely right, different figures, because different categories, and different legal basis for their resettlement, different programs, different laws. If we are talking about repatriates, that is, those who are restoring ties with their historical homeland, this is a special category. In the 24th year, 3,000 people received the relevant certificates. 1,800 of them are already in Russia and can settle in any region, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. Please do not confuse us here, and we are not talking about labor migration. We are not talking about refugees, political migrants. We are now talking only about these categories, repatriates and compatriots who participate in the program of resettlement of compatriots. Why are these figures not on the pages of leading Western publications? Because they destroy the myth of barbaric Russia, which everyone supposedly leaves. No, they're coming to us. Who wants to leave? Who wants to leave has already returned. Many have returned. But against this background, people also come to us from different countries. I've given you the figures. Why are they going? Everyone answers this question in their own way. Someone is close to the history of the country. Someone is close to the prospect and the future. Someone needs to develop their business, which has no future, for example, in their countries. Someone in order to preserve their identity, because they do not want children to be called it or quadrovers. Someone is going, I don't know, according to some ideas of his own, because he has been dreaming all his life. Because, for example, they see lies in the countries of the same collective West. We are not doing anything to entice. We are not specifically building any Potemkin villages here. We respond to those requests, which are now of a massive nature. We are expanding opportunities for people, even introducing new categories. Those people who are not compatriots, who are not repatriates, who were citizens of their country's flesh of flesh, but just want to save, in particular, families, large families, preserve faith, religion, preserve traditional values. Now there is a category that are government agencies and our public organizations are engaged in. Maria Butina, MP, how much effort she puts into helping just such a new category for us. It was formed literally in recent years. These data are available on the website of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Rosstat, on the Russian Century portal. Are you interested? I suggested links to you. We will definitely add a test of today's briefing. Western journalists will not look for these figures. They run from the truth. Do you understand? They are afraid of this truth. They are not paid for this truth. They are paid for something else, and are not looking for something else. Therefore, we now know what it is called and how much it costs through the Agency for International Development Assistance. As you remember, millions of dollars were spent to pay for, as it was said there, strategic silence. That's why you are horrified by the picture you see in the Western media. Therefore, while the European Union is trampling in the swamp of Russophobic fakes, Russia is building and creating and moving forward. So we are open to everyone who comes to us legally, who goes with a pure heart, who goes to create, respecting our country. We are historically open to all of them. It seems to me that Alexander Nevsky formulated it perfectly. Thank you, thank you. I think we will talk about this topic again, but it is impossible not to look forward to the upcoming great victory day of our common historical victory. Every day, he enters our hearts, our homes, our souls. I want to say again that, of course, we will talk about this in more detail, but we really live every day on the eve of this greatest event, the 80th anniversary of the victory. Happy holidays coming. All the best, prosperity.